Chapter 390, Anticipation. On Sunday morning, shortly after Klein finished his breakfast, he heard the doorbell ring as he had expected. But to his surprise, it wasn't just reporter Mike Joseph. Dr. Aaron was with him as well. "Sherlock, I had that nightmare again last night. I don't think it's normal." Aaron didn't keep matters a secret even with Mike around, revealing it the moment he entered the living room. Without waiting for Klein's reply, he took out his wallet and took out a paper crane. "Do you think this is the problem? Ever since I found it and started to carry it with me, I've been having nightmares." Klein nonchalantly glanced at it when his expression froze suddenly. If he hadn't been a clown in the past and had great control over his facial muscles, then he might have revealed an undisguised smile in front of the reporter and doctor. "Yes, a smile. This paper crane is even uglier than the one I made." This was the first thought that came to Klein's mind. At that moment, he had the urge to cover his face and sigh. Could having poor handicraft skills be a tradition of the Nighthawks? There was no doubt that the paper crane in front of him was the result of another switch. After receiving accurate information from Klein, the Nighthawks had seemingly sneaked into Dr. Aaron's bedroom without any delay and switched their folded paper crane for the one in his wallet. But what they didn't expect was that the one in the wallet was also a fake. It was folded by Klein above the gray fog and appeared rather crude. "I feel an inexplicable sense of joy." Klein glanced at Dr. Aaron, who didn't notice it, cleared his throat, and said, "Perhaps. I suggest that you go to the cathedral again and talk to the bishop you previously talked to. We need to believe that the gods that we believe in are always watching over us." As he spoke, he drew a triangular sacred emblem on his chest. After the nightmare had left last night, Klein had specifically gone above the gray fog to divine if it was dangerous having switched the paper crane. The result was that it was very safe. Thus, he was now able to make this suggestion with great interest, in an attempt to tease his former colleagues. "I wonder how they would feel seeing the paper crane that they didn't fold very well returned to them." Klein placated Dr. Aaron in all seriousness and turned to the reporter and said with a smile, "Mike, to tell the truth, what I really want to advise Aaron to do is to go see a psychiatrist, but faith can certainly soothe his soul." "You're not being frank at all." Mike laughed. "All right, let's go." The next day, Klein accompanied the Daily Observer reporter into Eastborough to interview the rescued girls. With a full £1 as payment for the interview, no one refused it, not even some of the abused girls. In this interview, Captain Sin was the main focus. The current situation of the girls was another main focus. The former made people angry, while the latter left people feeling heavy. Daisy was actually lucky enough to be able to return to work when she got home and use her labor to barter for food. Less than a third of those who were rescued were like her, and most of them were the kinds with some savings at home, and they were in a position that allowed the traumatized women to heal and have time before they sought out suitable jobs. As for the other two-thirds of those rescued, they had to continue working hard in order to survive. And in the face of the mass unemployment of textile workers, they were often only able to find temporary jobs with low wages. Those with parents and siblings who hadn't lost their jobs were still okay, at least, they were able to help each other, barely filling their stomachs. The families in less optimistic situations had already begun to walk the path of street girls, as though they had never been rescued. Their act of betraying their bodies once was perhaps only for some food. This caused Mike to turn silent like before, and it was only when it was dark and once he left Eastborough before his spirit returned. He thanked Klein. "Sherlock, it's all thanks to you. Otherwise, I definitely would have been blackmailed today by those rogue gangsters." "Isn't that why you hired me?" Klein smiled politely without any complacency. With old Kohler informing them beforehand, old Kohler and Liv's family hadn't revealed that he had helped search for Daisy for free. Especially when Daisy, who was pretty smart, was asked if she knew any relatively special people, she answered directly, "Mr. Reporter and Mr. Detective." Mike nodded sluggishly and walked on in silence for a long time. Before he boarded the carriage, he suddenly let out a sigh. I would like to make a call in this report for the government to use Capham's estate to set up a bursary fund, which will use the annual income to help the rescued girls and others who have been harmed by Capham to get them out of their predicament. Although Capham's safe had already been robbed clean by the hero bandit, his greatest wealth is the property he bought. These should have all been obtained illegally. Klein listened carefully, gave Mike a deep look, and said in sincere praise, "You're the best reporter I've ever met. There are plenty of reporters like me. There are always idealists in the world." Mike sighed. With that, he paid £10 to Klein and took off his hat and waved it. As he watched the reporter get into the rental carriage, Klein was about to take a public carriage in the other direction when Mike suddenly opened the window and asked with a jibing smile, "Sherlock, I'm not the only reporter you know, am I?" Klein was stunned for a moment, then he laughed. "Guess." "City of Silver." Like a trapped beast, Derek Berg paced around the room in anxiety. He felt that the chief wasn't paying enough attention to his report. He was worried that the exploration team members, who had been affected by the fallen creator to an unknown extent, would cause devastating damage to this city that had lasted for 2,582 years in the darkness after their quarantine. In such a situation, he was eager to obtain advice from Mr. Hanged Man, Miss Justice, and company, who were rather familiar with the fallen creator. This was the tarot gathering he anticipated the most. Wait a little while longer, just wait a little longer. If Mr. Fool doesn't summon me, I will pray directly to him. Derek tried to calm himself down, but his pacing didn't slow down one bit. Suddenly, he saw the endless gray fog and heard the messianic voice say, "Prepare for the gathering." With a sigh of relief, Derek sat down on the edge of the bed carefully and lay down, pretending to be ready to sleep due to exhaustion. After silently counting 1,000 rapid heartbeats, he waited for a while before he was engulfed by the illusory dark red light. At that moment, Derek's room was abnormally quiet. Lightning streaked across the sky outside his window, keeping the darkness away from the land. Suddenly, by the corner of his bed, a black figure squirmed and extended, taking the shape of a human. The dark figure quickly grew tall and quietly looked down at Derek. He carefully observed him for nearly a minute, then withdrew without gleaning anything. In the corner, the shadows remained the same, unchanging. The endless gray fog lingered beneath his feet as usual. The long bronze table in front of him was mottled with green rust, but it didn't seem to be rotten at all. The first things that Derek saw were Miss Justice and Miss Magician sitting opposite him. The familiar, jovial greeting sounded in his ear. "Good afternoon, Mr. Fool." "Good afternoon." Klein, shrouded in gray fog, nodded slightly. He seemed to respond leisurely to Miss Justice and the other members' greetings, but in reality, he was busy manipulating the world, making him appear like a real person. After yesterday's interviews with reporter Mike, it was already dinner time. Klein went to a restaurant that served Feinapotter cuisine, and he was so overwhelmed by the spiciness that he voluntarily ordered a cup of desert beer. After eating his fill and returning home, he didn't go out again for the rest of the day. Neither did he study the Book of Secrets or prepare his own food. That eased the heavy emotions he felt whenever he went to Eastborough. Without realizing it, the afternoon had arrived, and his thoughts shifted to the tarot gathering. After the greetings, Justice, Audrey, restrained her curiosity and excitement, and she was in no hurry to inquire about the truth behind the Capham incident. "Mr. Fool might not answer, but how would I know if he wishes to answer if I don't ask? Well, I hope he makes a request of equal value, and I'll do my best to fulfill it." Audrey looked around at the other members and observed the states of the other members. As a telepathist, she very quickly discovered something strange. The son appears very anxious. Did something happen to the previous exploration team captain? Did he encounter Amon? In addition, Furs is in an indecisive state of wanting to ask but not daring to. She must have seen the papers and guessed from the tarot cards that our tarot club was involved in Capim's death. But she's curious who the Emperor card represents. She seems to be even more in awe of Mr. Fool. What happened? Mr. Hanged Man seems to be in a very good mood. He's finished digesting his potion. He seems to be anticipating something. Mr. World is still as gloomy and reserved as before, and it's hard to read his thoughts. He really is the nemesis of the spectator pathway. Derek didn't try to hide his anxiety, but he didn't consult the other tarot club members directly. He knew perfectly well that the initial time belonged to Mr. Fool, unless there were no so-called Roselle diary entries. There's no need to rush. The gathering has already begun. If Mr. Fool is in a good mood, he might be able to answer some questions. Derek consoled himself. Alger looked up and humbly said, "Honorable Mr. Fool, I've found 3 new pages of Roselle's diary." Diary? Roselle's diary? Furs pricked up her ears. Klein smiled and replied, "What do you want to exchange them for?" Glancing at the card next to Mr. Fool's hand, Alger suppressed his eagerness and said, "I want to know what that card you have next to you is." Chapter 391, The Great Seafarer Roselle. I know that. Audrey's eyes were half-turned, and her chin was slightly raised. She happily cast her gaze diagonally across her, towards a stone pillar that supported the dome. She quickly withdrew her gaze, ready to admire the reaction of Mr. Hanged Man after he heard the answer. Furs vaguely realized one thing: the so-called Roselle's diary can be exchanged with Mr. Fool for answers to certain questions, and maybe even some items. Roselle's diary? Is it referring to the notes that are written with Roselle's unique symbols that no one can interpret? They were actually diary entries? Mr. Hanged Man's tone sounded very firm and Mr. Fool didn't retort him. "I've encountered many, but I've never bought any of them because I wasn't interested." "Ah, yes, Miss Audrey has quite a few. She's a fanatic when it comes to this. But that dog of hers, last week, no, maybe last week, I don't remember it too well. Basically, it tore up many books and notes, including all of the diary entries from Emperor Roselle." The sudden surprise and disappointment that emerged had filled her heart and made her want to raise her hands, cover her ears, and scream. That wasn't enough to express her current feelings. "I hate dogs," Furs bitterly thought. The Hanged Man's request was somewhat beyond Klein's expectations. However, it was the easiest for him to complete. He chuckled and said, "Sure. Do you want everyone to hear it, or do you want to be the only one to know it?" Alger replied without hesitation, "Only myself." He didn't have the spirit of selfless devotion to others. Klein laughed and blocked the senses of the other members, which made Miss Justice very upset. She was waiting to see Mr. Hanged Man's stunned and shocked expression, as though she had done something great herself. Although she couldn't proclaim it out loud, she still looked forward to the subsequent reaction after Mr. Hanged Man knew the answer. But now, that detestable Hanged Man has deprived me of this happiness. Audrey grumbled inwardly. Of course, she was very clear that his request was absolutely justified. "But I already know the answer," she pursed her lips and thought. At this moment, Klein leisurely flipped over the card of blasphemy and held it vertically, allowing the Hanged Man to directly see the black-armored, crowned, and caped Roselle. It was common to see the portrait of Emperor Roselle, so Alger recognized him immediately. More importantly, there was a clear sign on the card saying, "Sequence 0, Dark Emperor." Indeed. It's the rumored deck of cards, which contains the Paths of the Divine, made by Emperor Roselle. It's the original prototype of tarot cards. Sequence 0, Dark Emperor. Is this the lawyer pathway to becoming divine? Mr. Fool has been collecting Roselle's diary all this time, apparently in order to find clues to this deck of cards, and in a matter of months, he has already acquired one. Alger was surprised and delighted, as well as excited and agitated. All of a sudden, he inexplicably felt that the future of the Tarot Club was incomparably bright. Previously, he had only been intimidated by the mysteriousness and potency of Mr. Fool, and he had only held the notion of using the Tarot Club to exchange information and goods. But now, he began to think of the advantages that he and the other members could reap when Mr. Fool managed to collect all of Emperor Roselle's cards. At that time, the Tarot Club might become the most powerful secret organization. Alger couldn't help but look forward to the future. Then Klein said slowly, "A card of blasphemy." He then immediately removed the isolation barrier. As soon as she regained her senses, Justice Audrey immediately turned her gaze towards the hanged man. Through the blurred image, she could vaguely read the remaining shock, joy, and yearning from the other party. That's more like it. Audrey was immediately greatly satisfied. A card of blasphemy. Indeed, it's related to the blasphemy slate. Alger bowed his head in thought for a few seconds and began to conjure the 3 pages of Roselle's diary. Soon, the 3 yellowish-brown goatskin parchments were in Klein's hands. He casually lowered his gaze and started reading at a moderate pace. March 15th. I really am the protagonist. With just some archaeological clues and folklore, I've found a ghost ship left behind by the Solomon Empire in the Fog Sea's boundary at the Auric Archipelago, the Dark King. It's really cool. There are some ancient books on it, including a treasure map pointing to some nameless island. That's the final settlement of a great noble of the Solomon Empire who was defeated and left the northern continent. Everything that he left behind is there. This treasure will definitely belong to me. March 19th. After much deliberation and consideration, I've finally decided to set out on a long voyage. After that, I'll enter the Royal Army as an officer, so it will be hard for me to have an opportunity such as this again. Edwards and Grimm are willing to take the risk and follow me into that foggy sea. Actually, I don't just want the treasures. I also wanted to verify something, from the sun, the red moon, to the trajectory of the stars in the sky, as well as the changes in 4 seasons, all sorts of signs and different data to prove that the world I'm on should be a planet. In that case, it shouldn't only be the northern and southern continents. Based on the various data, the land mass occupied by the 2 continents totaled up isn't even a tenth of the planet's surface area. Could the rest of it be the sea and islands? To the west of the northern and southern continent is the Fog Sea, to the east is the Sonia Sea. I suspect that there are other continents at the end of these 2 seas, just like how the southern continent is at the end of the Berserk Sea. Maybe I can find a brand new continent, the Western Continent. Let's go, great seafarer Roselle Columbus Magellan Gustav, go and verify your conjecture. The Emperor sure was reckless when he was young. He actually dared to go on a voyage just because he received a treasure map that he had no clue about its authenticity, or if it held any danger. No, he's as rash as he was when he was young, even in his old age. The cards of blasphemy are evidence of this. Klein couldn't help but lampoon. The diary entry seems to be linked to a page or 2 that he had seen before, separated by at most 1 or 2 other diary entries, so Klein was almost certain that Roselle had lost his way in this voyage and ended up finding a primitive island just outside of the safe sea routes. On it, there were a number of beyonder creatures. In the process, he had also teased Grimm and Edwards, who were following him to sea, using the memes of the 4 horsemen of the Apocalypse and the Pirate King. In addition, Grimm, who had been praised by Roselle as the smartest of them all, became increasingly stranger after discovering the primitive island, and he ended up dying in the Fog Sea. Speaking of which, the idea that the world is a planet is now widely accepted and confirmed by astronomy. Klein turned to the second page of the diary. April 18th. I discovered the term Western Continent in an ancient book on the Dark King. There really is a Western Continent. However, even during the 4th epoch, in the Solomon Empire, when the gods were still walking the lands, the Western Continent was only a rumor. Legend has it that it was the homeland of the elves, and it was related to the ancient god named Saniathrim. The problem with that is that the elves ended up on Sonia Island and later scattered themselves over the mountains and the numerous islands in the seas, and there is no legend that they have ever tried to return to their homeland. In short, the end of the Fog Sea might be the western continent, the homeland of the elves. Then, what's at the end of the Sonia Sea? Is there really an eastern continent? Where is it hidden in the books of myths? Could it be the ethereal forsaken land of the gods? Proceed onward, Roselle. You're about to reach your destination. The western continent, the eastern continent. Roselle guessed that the latter might be the forsaken land of the gods. Yes, Mr. Hanged Man once said that many members of the Aurora Order were searching the Sonia Sea for the true Creator's holy residence. And he suspects that the holy residence is the forsaken land of the gods. This is in line with Emperor Roselle's thoughts. This world has many secrets. Klein lowered his gaze towards the last few paragraphs of the page. April 20th. All signs indicate that we're about to reach a continent, not the land from an island. There's actually a benefit to being lost? Could it be that I've discovered the so-called Western continent? April 21st. I saw the abyss. Abyss? Did Roselle see the abyss in the sense of mysticism? Klein's pupils shrank as he quickly turned the page. But the third page of his diary made him doubt his life and his many years of Chinese education. It was filled with the following sentences: fuck hungry please people in manner. This. Klein realized that this was probably a subsequent forgery of Roselle's diary entries. They had randomly pieced together a bunch of sentences based on the original symbols. At this moment, Klein felt like he was seeing intelligible characters and had the urge to curse those forgers. He wanted to know if the abyss mentioned in Roselle's diary was the abyss to which the terms source of evil, land of corruption, and home of devils referred to. The true abyss is the dark side of the universe where even gods can be corroded. It should be independent from the real world, just like the spirit world. At the very least, this is what the Book of Secrets and the books which I came into contact with during my time with the Nighthawk say. If it's not the true abyss, then what did the Emperor mean by abyss? Klein thought about it, over and over again, but was unable to come up with an explanation. He felt extremely dissatisfied, just like when a novel was dropped by the author at the most critical moment. With a single glance, he calmed down and let the diary entries disappear from his hands. You can begin. Sitting at the head of the long bronze table, he chuckled. Alger turned his head immediately towards the sun, asking indifferently, "Have you gotten anything from the former captain of that exploration team?" Chapter 392, Listening to Little Sun's story. Derek was originally anxious to ask about the fallen creator, but when he heard the Hanged Man's question, he answered honestly, "He's dead." "He's dead?" Justice, the Hanged Man, and the magician expressed their surprise at the same time. They really didn't expect this turn of events. After all, the former captain of the exploration team had been locked up for decades without any problems. Who would have thought that he would die right after they discussed about him? At this moment, aside from Mr. Fool, only the gloomy and reserved the world maintained his original state. Derek nodded and said, "Yes. After I returned to the City of Silver, I wanted to glean more information from the former captain using Mr. Hanged Man's suggestions, but he suddenly appeared behind me, asking me if I was looking for him." Upon hearing this, Audrey suddenly drew a short breath. Although the son obviously lacked the ability to tell a good story, his simple descriptions still gave her the feeling of reading horror novels late into the night. It was as if someone was standing behind her, also asking, "Are you looking for me?" Furs was as frightened as she was excited, having found the feeling she had as a child listening to her mother's recount of a ghost story. Despite covering her ears in fear, it felt like someone had possessed her and pried open the gaps between her fingers, allowing the voice to be transmitted into her brain. This passage can be written into a novel. As a best-selling writer, she had outstanding professional instincts. Alger, being experienced and knowledgeable, subconsciously asked, "Doesn't your City of Silver's dungeon have seals targeting rampagers? Is there no barrier between them? I remember that last time you said that there was a very powerful and mysterious item at the core." "Yes, but I don't know how or why he came to my room." He had completely lost control of himself, his head had split open in the middle and fluid kept flowing out. There were many cracks on his body, and each crack was a mouth, Derek said, describing the scene in passing. "Then, how did you survive? How did you escape from his, no, it's jaws?" Furs felt immersed, and it was also a question which Audrey was concerned about. Alger's reaction was very different from theirs. He thoughtfully murmured, "It doesn't make sense to put you, a person who only shows signs of losing control, next to such a dangerous fellow. From the looks of it, the upper echelons of your City of Silver, the members of the 6-member council, deliberately made you interact with him, hoping to gather useful information from him and observe any corresponding changes. So, which elder saved you?" Derek's mouth gaped a little, feeling as if Mr. Hanged Man had personally seen and heard everything that had happened. Just based on the situation I described, he was able to guess the truth. How amazing! Derek answered with admiration, "Yes, just as you said, the chief appeared just in time and used the mystical item to deal with the rampager." Noticing the respect and admiration from the son, Alger let out a chuckle. "It's quite an obvious case. As long as one is experienced enough, you'll easily be able to notice this." "I didn't think of it." Audrey muttered to herself, somewhat depressed. "I couldn't tell." Furs ran her hand through her hair, ashamed. "I didn't think in that direction." "The world," repeated Mr. Fool's sigh. After saying that, Alger frowned slightly and slowly asked, "You said that not long after you returned, the former captain of the exploration team lost control?" "He didn't lose control for decades, but he suddenly lost control after you returned?" At the same time, Mr. Hanged Man raised his head and looked at Mr. Fool. Seeing that Mr. Fool was very calm and without any hint of abnormalities, his mood immediately eased. All the uneasiness he had just now turned into questions. "The Amon family is known as blasphemers. Could it be that that person discovered the Tarot Club and the secret above the grey fog, but he was easily finished off by Mr. Fool?" Derek nodded seriously and said, "I guess 2 reasons. One was because I chose the sun pathway, and you said that the Amon family was the descendant of an ancient sun god. The other reason is that he noticed that Mr. Fool was pulling me in to attend the gathering, so changes happened to him, and it was proven to be the latter." "How was it proven?" Alger pressed, leaving no stone unturned. "Someone sensed that Mr. Fool was pulling him in to attend the gathering? Someone can really detect it? How terrifying. As expected of a blasphemer." Audrey was astonished and shocked. She couldn't help but glance at the end of the long bronze table, and she was immediately comforted by Mr. Fool's calm and indifferent attitude. "It's just a trivial matter." To Mr. Fool, it's just a trivial matter. Audrey thought with joy and relief. So it turns out that someone is able to discover the Tarot Club's gathering. As expected, with so many pathways and so many sequences, there would always be a beyonder power that can detect this. But for me right now, this is a very bad thing. I'm still too weak. I have to advance my sequence as soon as possible. Furs was momentarily surprised and frightened. Derek truthfully described the events. "I saw Amon's shadow when the rampager was finished off by the chief. It should be him. This is what he looks like." With the approval of Mr. Fool, Derek conjured a light screen depicting Amon. A black classic robe, a matching pointed hat, a crystal monocle, a broad forehead, a thin face, black eyes, black curly hair. "Have any of you seen him before?" Derek asked hopefully. The Hanged Man, Justice, the Magician, and the world shook their heads in unison. Without harping on the matter, Derek continued, "Amon's shadow was eliminated by the chief with the help of the mystical item, leaving being a translucent worm. The chief told me that it was only an avatar of Amon. He explained to me the reason for arranging it, so I lived beside him. After confirming that I was fine, he allowed me to return home. I was a little afraid, unaware of any subsequent actions Amon might take. Therefore, the moment I reached home, I prayed to Mr. Fool. Wait, Alger interrupted the son with a frown, you said that you just experienced such a strange and terrifying incident, and the chief let you go home just like that? And the moment you returned home, you didn't do anything but first pray to Mr. Fool? Yes, Derek answered blankly. What's wrong with that? He found Mr. Hanged Man's attitude rather odd. Audrey vaguely felt that what the son had done wasn't right, but she couldn't immediately figure out what was wrong. She just believed that if she were in his shoes, she definitely wouldn't have done that. But at that very moment, furs had already covered her face. Too careless. I was like that in the past, and the price of that was to use up a stone on my bracelet and start bearing the curse of the full moon. The best-selling writer sighed in her heart. Alger glanced at Mr. Fool again. Seeing that he remained indifferent, he forced himself to relax. He held his fist against his nose and said, after having such an interaction with that strange Amon, do you think the chief will just do a cursory inspection and be completely reassured about you? If that's really the case, that former captain of the exploratory team wouldn't have been imprisoned for 42 years. In my experience, the chief has definitely sent someone to secretly monitor you, and you've undoubtedly exposed your own uniqueness. Don't doubt this. If the chief isn't that careful, then there's no way your city of silver can last till this day under such abject environments. This. Derek's eyes widened, being even more convinced that Mr. Hanged Man was truly knowledgeable and that what he said made a lot of sense. The chief discovered something abnormal about me? So, that's why he had such an attitude when he heard my report? What should I do? What should I do? Derek immediately became nervous and frightened. Noticing his concern, Alger scoffed. However, you don't have to worry about it for now. I just thought about it, even if your City of Silver's chief found out about your abnormality, he would only suspect that you were possessed by Amon, that you've been contaminated by him, and wouldn't think of the Tarot Club. You still have time, so you can slowly think of a way to resolve this problem. Derek calmed down a little and honestly said, back then, I really was possessed by Amon. What? Alger blurted out. He nearly left his seat, taking on a combat stance to fend off any accidents. Audrey and Furs immediately tensed up. Only the gloomy world showed mere surprise. Startled by the reaction of Mr. Hanged Man, Derek quickly added, Mr. Fool discovered it while I was praying. As he spoke, he conjured the scene which Mr. Fool had sent to him back then. Dressed in a pointed hat and a crystal monocle, Amon's illusory figure was coiled around his spirit body like the ghost of a python. Seeing Justice and Magician trembling from the bottom of their hearts, the Hanged Man immediately pressed on, what happened next? Later, Mr. Fool taught me a ritual. Through the ritual, he sent his angel to purify Amon's avatar, Derek replied without embellishing or simplifying anything. Angel? The Hanged Man looked in shock at the end of the bronze table. He hurriedly lowered his head when he realized that his actions were impulsive and impolite. Angel? Audrey was momentarily left dazed. Chapter 393, The Worm of Time. After a brief moment of blankness, Audrey quickly understood what the son was saying. He was saying that Mr. Fool had sent his angel to purify Amon's avatar. Angel. Mr. Fool sent an angel. Mr. Fool really has an angel as an attendant. Every angel has at least the power of a sequence too. Although that's expected and I've already expected it, it's still amazing because it has finally been verified. And only deities can control angels. Audrey's eyes shone with excitement. She couldn't help but wonder what Mr. Fool's angel looked like. I wonder if I'll be lucky enough to see that. She looked towards the end of the long bronze table with admiration and zeal. At the same time, her spiritual perception told her that Mr. World, who was always gloomy, had also sat up straight in shock, which pleased her inexplicably. Furs recalled what had happened to her previously. She had only asked Mr. Fool to interfere with any divinations, and she ended up seeing a 12-winged archangel descend, enveloping her spirit body with its wings. It really was an angel. Black wings, an archangel with 12 pairs of wings. And this really is just a routine procedure for Mr. Fool. He would send an angel to help members of the gathering get out of trouble. Furs suddenly didn't dare to look up at the gentleman who was sitting leisurely at the end of the long bronze table. Although she was still only sequence 9, and she hadn't received a complete education in the field of mysticism, she had been involved with different Beyonder circles for 3 years. She would have learned of certain things even if she didn't deliberately find out about them. In the midst of all of this, there was a very important clause: you may not look directly at God. In the past, this sentence didn't leave much of an impression on Furs, but now she suddenly felt that it was the truth derived from countless bloody lessons. Angel? Mr. Fool really does have an angel by his side. The hanged man felt a wave of fear and baffling excitement hit him, causing his body to tremble slightly. Previously, when he told us his honorific name and responded to prayers and rituals, this had indirectly expressed the notion that Mr. Fool was equivalent to a god. However, direct evidence was still lacking. But now, an angel has appeared. The existence of that alone is enough to explain many things. Amongst them, the most important thing is that angels represent the most direct form of deterrence. Mr. Fool is not without influence in the real world. Even if he doesn't go through his adorers, he can still project his majesty onto a certain region. Alger immediately thought of many things. He broke into a cold sweat for his shallow actions in the past while feeling filled with hope for the future. Immediately following that, he started to think about the details of what the sun had said. Mr. Fool didn't let the angel descend directly. Instead, he taught the sun a ritual. Through that ritual, he sent the angel to purify Amon's avatar. That's quite a roundabout way of doing things. Does this mean that in order to influence the real world, Mr. Fool must break through many obstacles? This is consistent with my earlier judgment that he is in a sealed and confined state. Or perhaps there's something special about the forsaken land of the gods? The reason why Mr. Fool didn't act like this before was because he has escaped a little. He is gradually freeing himself. Sitting at Mr. Fool's seat, Klein slowly looked around. He was obviously aware of Miss Justice's reverence and zeal, as well as the fear and excitement of the hanged man. Weren't you always treating me like a god in the past? Why are you acting like this after hearing about the angel? It seems like indirect evidence ultimately cannot be compared to the shock and awe delivered by direct evidence. If a new member were to question me in the future, would make preparations in advance for the world to step forward and say something. Then, would casually point my finger and kill him as an example to others. Once things calm down, would make anew the world. Klein's thoughts gradually wandered. Derek didn't quite understand the reactions of Mr. Hanged Man and Miss Justice. From his point of view, wasn't it normal that an angel served a god or a mighty existence? After pondering for a few seconds, he said, after Amon's avatar was purified, I coughed out a worm that was exactly identical to the one in the dungeon. Do you know what it is? With the help of Klein's help, the sun successfully conjured a projection of a translucent worm with 12 transparent rings. Audrey and Furs looked over curiously. At the same time, they shook their heads, indicating that they had never seen or heard of this kind of worm. 12 rings. In the Book of Secrets, all similar symbols have something to do with time. The Amon family was descended from an ancient sun god, and in ancient times, people believed that the sun and time were related. This can barely be considered an explanation and can be verified from 2 angles. However, why is it that the current eternal blazing sun is the inextinguishable light, embodiment of order, god of deeds, and guardian of businesses, but he doesn't seem to be involved in the domain that deals with time? In order to maintain his image as the fool, Klein was in no hurry to answer. He smiled, his gaze warm. Alger thought for a moment before saying, it should be the vessel that Amon created for his avatar. In legends, there is a type of worm that looks similar, appearance-wise. They have 12 transparent rings and are called worms of time. However, no one has ever seen them before. Many people suspect that it's actually the name of a sequence potion. Worm of time. So it's very close to my guess. Although this is just a legend spread among beyonders at the middle echelons of particular churches and above, the information itself is of great value. Is Mr. Hanged Man saying this out loud to let others know this because he has been rewarded, having learned a lot of important information from the sun? Klein felt wistful and amused at the same time. Worm of time. The vessel that Amon created for his avatar, Derek whispered to himself, as though he had resolved many of his doubts. He curiously asked, what can it be used for? I mean, when it's dead. I don't know. Faced with the sun's trust and respectful gaze, Alger suddenly felt a little ashamed. At that moment, the fool, who was sitting at the very end of the long bronze table, spoke calmly, the main material of certain rituals. This was what Klein had surmised from the contents of the Book of Secrets. However, he wasn't worried that he would say anything wrong, because it was almost impossible to prove it. Failing to find the ritual that requires a worm of time just serves to prove that you're not knowledgeable enough. Klein casually added inwardly. Certain rituals. Audrey and the others instantly let their imaginations run wild. Thank you, the great Mr. Fool. Derek got up halfway and bowed. Following that, the topic steered towards the matter that threatened the existence of the City of Silver. The exploratory team is back. I'm referring to the team led by Shepherd Elder Lovia. They completed the exploration of the fallen creator's half-destroyed temple and have returned to the City of Silver. And I discovered that a few of the team members that I know have undergone a certain degree of change. They've been corrupted by the true creator. Alger didn't hesitate to point that out with a tone of certainty. The true creator? Audrey couldn't help but look at the end of the bronze table. She remembered very clearly that the true creator had once had its descent foiled by Mr. Fool's adorer. She had even guessed that the leader of their tarot club was going to be the nemesis of evil gods. Really? Derek returned, refusing to believe it. The Hanged Man calmly said, describe their changes in detail. I still feel like he's the same person, but he's very different from before. His original optimism has now turned heavy. There's only a polite smile left from his former bright smile. Derek shared everything abnormal that he had discovered, including the sudden improvement in Shepherd Elder Lovia's state. Alger said in deliberation, the situation might be worse than you think. Corruption could be the best possibility. Now, if they truly believe, from the bottom of their hearts, in the true, fallen creator, that would be trouble, and they would be irredeemable. Regardless, their characters, thoughts, and viewpoints would all be warped, turning into hidden lunatics. You can take action from this angle, letting other members of the 6-member council notice that something is amiss. I've already reported the matter, but the chief doesn't seem to trust me too much, Derek said in a slightly aggrieved and heavy manner. Furs couldn't help but sigh. That's because your chief is suspecting that you're possessed by Amon and planning something nefarious against the City of Silver. Then, what should I do? Even if I tell them of the existence of the fallen creator, they wouldn't believe me, am I right? Derek asked anxiously. The Hanged Man pondered for 2 seconds before saying, in truth, your chief should have begun paying attention to the shepherd and the exploratory team members. For your City of Silver to survive to this day, the upper echelons will definitely have the most basic level of vigilance and not neglect any possible threats. The only problem is that the importance they place on this matter is definitely insufficient, at the very least, it's not as important as their attention on you and Amon. Without waiting for the son to speak, he added after some deliberation, perhaps you can use this incident to wipe away the suspicion on you. Find an opportunity to make a particular exploratory team member to show the most thorough extent of an abnormality and enter into a conflict with him. That way, the other members of the 6-member council will notice that something isn't right and raise the priority on this matter. At the same time, hand over the suspected worm of time and say that you suddenly felt your mind be adrift while the conflict was happening and that you had no idea what happened. You only vaguely heard someone shouting, "True Creator," before you woke up. And by then, you had already coughed out that worm. When an evil god is involved, there are many means and abilities that one wouldn't dare use without thought. Your chief would adhere to logic and guess that Amon's avatar and the mental corruption left behind by the true creator had entered into conflict, eventually being destroyed and reduced to a dead worm. The surveillance on you would definitely decline significantly. If you act normally for an additional period of time, then the suspicion placed on you would be completely gone. Why does Mr. Hanged Man seem so well versed in this aspect? Audrey thought with her mouth slightly open. Derek's eyes lit up when he heard this, and he felt that Mr. Hanged Man was indeed trustworthy. He had come up with such a good idea. Then, how do I make that exploratory team member display the most thorough extent of his abnormality? He quickly asked. Alger fell silent for a few seconds before saying, "I don't know." He then added, "It would be great if there are items related to the true creator." With a whoosh, Audrey looked towards the fool who was seated at the end of the long bronze table. Chapter 394, Sights in the Spirit World. Klein knew very well why Miss Justice was looking at him. Being aware of the Lenivus incident, she was certain that he had many conflicts, both in the open and in the shadows, between himself and the true creator, and that it was normal for him to have the corresponding items, perhaps even quite a few of them, in his possession. Logically speaking, there's nothing wrong with her thinking. In fact, I have crossed the true creator several times, and I do have an item that fits those descriptions. Klein sighed inwardly. There was no question about helping little Sunday. There were many monsters in the forsaken land of the gods where the City of Silver was located, allowing the collection of several materials which were rare in the northern and southern continents. In addition, they had a contiguous history that wasn't distorted by any of the deities or churches. They gave the most objective stories and secrets prior to the cataclysm, and the knowledge involved was extremely valuable. Whether it was from the perspective of the Tarot Club's leader, or simply considering his own interests, Klein had no intention of giving up Little Sun or the City of Silver unless it was hopeless. However, there were certain things which weren't suitable for Mr. Fool to voice out. Just as Audrey was looking expectantly at Mr. Fool, who was shrouded in a thick grey fog, the world, who had been silent all this time, finally opened his mouth. "I have an item that contains the mental corruption of the true creator." He was referring to the all-black eye that Nimblewright Master Rosago had left behind. An item containing the mental corruption of the true creator? Alger thought as he organized his words. This might be able to help the sun. Once those exploratory team members, whose thoughts and viewpoints have been warped, sense the mental imprint of the true creator, there's a high possibility that they will mutate right on the spot. The world looked at the sun and laughed hoarsely. "Kid, I can lend you that item, but what will you be using to pay for it?" Having seen hope, Derek's mind raced, suddenly remembering what had happened during previous gatherings, and quickly said, "I can help you find the characteristics of the human skin shadow, the mutated pituitary gland and blood of a thousand-faced hunter. I can also attempt to obtain the method to removing the mental corruption on an item left behind by a rampager. Whichever I get first will be used as payment." Out of all of the options, the human skin shadow was relatively easy to encounter. It was one of the scarier monsters in the depths of the darkness. At this moment, Derek wasn't considering whether the exchange was of equal value or not. Even though a one-time loan of an item contaminated by the true creator was obviously not worth as much as the conditions he put forward, under the current circumstances, he could grit his teeth and accept whatever high price the world offered. Thus, he might as well proactively show his sincerity. The world nodded slightly. "Very good, I will ask for Mr. Fool's help to lend it to you." As he spoke, he revealed the shape of the all-black eye and added, "It's the equivalent of a sequence 5 Beyonder. If you lose it, you'll have to provide me with compensation. Also, as soon as this is over, return it to me." This was what Klein couldn't say in his capacity as the Fool. If a god-level existence like him kept harping about compensation and remember to return it to me, then the status he had built up for himself would have collapsed. In addition, Klein took into account the hidden dangers that lay in the future. The all-black eye and the other items were all things that he had used in the real world. If he were to bring in a new member who knew of this matter, they could confirm certain matters based on this point. Therefore, allowing Sherlock Moriarty to be equivalent to the world was clearly better than having Sherlock Moriarty be equivalent to the Fool. When your strength doesn't match your status, all I can do is tremble in fear, as if I were treading on thin ice or facing the abyss. Klein sighed silently. Seeing that Mr. Fool hadn't refused the world's request, nor did he point out any problems with the deal, Derek was relieved and quickly agreed to all the demands. At the same time, Audrey was genuinely happy for little Sunday. Alger thought for a while before letting out a sigh. He then said to the son in a measured tone, "Don't be too optimistic. How to seize this opportunity still needs to be organized. First, you have to choose a time and, without putting yourself in danger, have only one exploratory team member be present while there are several City of Silver citizens, or when they're all in a quarantined and sealed state. You have to use a wall of spirituality to seal the vessel that stores the corrupted item ahead of time and not allow anyone to notice it. By doing that, you can control the development of the situation. In addition, you need to consider how to hide that item after it's over. You mustn't let the 6-member council discover it, otherwise, you'll never be able to clear the suspicion on you. If such an easily deceived fellow were to die, it would be difficult for me to obtain any more information regarding the forsaken land of the gods or the secrets of the ancient era." The Hanged Man didn't find it problematic to offer help. Under his tutelage, Derek gradually had a complete plan and a few key points to take note of. "Thank you, Mr. Hanged Man. Thank you to all of you." He sincerely expressed his gratitude to every member in the gathering. This made Audrey feel the satisfaction of doing a good deed. The matter of the sun came to an end at this point, and Furs, who had witnessed it all, suddenly had an idea. She ruffled her slightly curled long hair and said, "I wish to know which family the apprentice pathway belongs to. I'm willing to use one of the chapters in the sites in the spirit world as a barter." Although the content is considered the ravings of a dreamer, many of the things described in it are true from my experiences into the spirit world. The Sights in the Spirit World was one of the mysticism notebooks that Mrs. Alyssa had left her. The logic of the content was incoherent, absurd, and just reading it alone left one irritable. However, when her body entered and left the spirit world 3 times for a variety of reasons, Furs discovered that the records in the notebook might not necessarily just be ravings. Sights in the spirit world? Klein leaned back slightly as he controlled the world to answer before the Hanged Man. "I know the answer, and I can give you some of the corresponding information for free." He knew very well that the Hanged Man could also answer the magician's questions. It's bad to have competition, that's why you need to combine it with free gifts. Klein silently lampooned. "All right." Furs felt a surge of joy. She discovered that the Tarot Club really was much more high-end than the other Beyonder circles that she had participated in before. Many difficult questions could be answered here. At this moment, the world asked in a low voice, "Do you want to hear the answer for yourself or have everyone else hear it too?" Furs pondered for a few seconds, then caught Audrey and the others by surprise with her answer. "Just say it out here." In her opinion, the answers to her own questions were of little help to others, and it didn't matter if they found out, and if Mr. World had left something out, or gave an incomplete description, and someone else happened to know the corresponding content, then she would be able to use the same sites in the Spirit World chapter to obtain the full picture. She believed that it was more important that way. The world wasn't surprised and said in a low and hoarse voice, in the fourth epoch, the apprentice pathway was wielded by the Abraham family. Later, it was spread to the Tamara family, which had been in marriage alliances with it for extended periods of time. In the fifth epoch, which is the present epoch, the Theosophy order also has the apprentice and trickmaster potion formulas. They're widely believed to be related to the Abraham and Tamara families. Of course, there are also people who suspect that the Theosophy order is actually a guise of the Demonist sect. Considering that Miss Magician had already met with members of the Abraham family, Klein added via the world, it is said that the Abraham family has suffered a bloodline curse all this time. They have no choice but to take up residence separately from each other in order to avoid danger. Bloodline curse? Furza's eyes widened as she thought of her encounters. Mrs. Elisa's husband belonged to the Abraham family, and that Mr. Lawrence is also a part of the Abraham family? Is that why she said that as long as one isn't a member of the family clan, they wouldn't suffer the curse? However, I used the bracelet, and it belongs to the Abraham family? Once again, regret gnawed at her soul. This was the first time that Alger and Audrey was hearing about the bloodline curse of the Abraham family. Both of them had their own thoughts, so no one spoke up for a short period of time. After a while, Furs took a deep breath and said, "Thank you, Mr. World. You have answered the biggest question I have. I will copy the first chapter of the sites in the spirit world after the end of this gathering and sacrifice it to Mr. Fool. Is that okay, Mr. Fool? The magician is a descendant of the Abraham family? It's no wonder her body can enter and exit the spirit world. She likely possesses a corresponding mystical item." The hanged man suddenly looked at her. Furs is a member of the Abraham family? She was born in an ancient family dating back to the fourth epoch. Audrey nodded as if she was thinking about something. After receiving a positive reply from Mr. Fool, Furs relaxed and began mentioning her desire to buy the Beyonder ingredients, stomach pouch of a spirit eater and the blood of a deep-sea marlin. Unfortunately, the sun wasn't going out during this period of time, so there was nothing. As for the hanged man, he merely mentioned that he had clues to the deep-sea marlin's blood. No one had obtained the formula for the wind-blessed potion yet. On the other hand, Audrey wasn't in a hurry to purchase the psychiatrist formula because she was about to join the psychology alchemists. Klein originally wanted to sell either the werewolf Beyonder characteristic or biological poison bottle, but after considering the latter's compatibility with his spirit body state and the current financial situation of the members, he temporarily gave up on that idea. The transaction segment quickly ended, and the gathering reached the stage where each of them could share information they had heard about. Audrey slowly looked around and said with a slight smile, "Last week, an interesting case happened in Backland. The protagonist is called the hero bandit Dark Emperor." Chapter 395, The Sheriff Beyonder Characteristics Dark Emperor. The hanged man, who was casually listening to Miss Justice, suddenly raised his head. His gaze suddenly became sharp and piercing. He had just learned that the card in Mr. Fool's hand was one of the cards of blasphemy created by Emperor Roselle. The name of the card was Dark Emperor. Does this have to do with Mr. Fool? Alger quickly glanced at the end of the long bronze table, before immediately lowering his head. If it was really done by Mr. Fool's adorer, this definitely isn't a simple matter. Alger listened attentively to Miss Justice's subsequent descriptions. Furs, who had long since learned of this from Zio and had some predictions about it, also gave the fool a glance. She wanted to see the truth from the concealed entity's reaction, but the fool remained as calm as ever in the thick gray fog. Audrey, who wasn't able to glean anything either, paused for a moment, then continued, "The victim is a tycoon, Capim. Many rumors point to him being the biggest human trafficker in Backland. Hero-banded Dark Emperor infiltrated his villa and robbed him of his life, rescuing many innocent girls who were locked up in his underground dungeon. When Capim's corpse was discovered, it was covered with a deck of tarot cards. His face was covered with the cards, Judgment and the Emperor. She didn't mention the safe as she found it unimportant. Covered with tarot cards? Is that the symbol for when our tarot club takes action? Wait a minute, a human trafficker? Alger sharply noticed a phrase. He turned to the end of the long bronze table and humbly asked, "Mr. Fool, is Capim related to the disappearance of the colonial slaves?" The latter was a mission had been assigned to him by the Church of the Lord of Storms, and he had formally targeted a suspect named Balin and had asked Backland residents, Justice, the Magician, and the world, to keep an eye out for him. As a result, upon hearing the word human trafficker, Alger intuitively believed that it had something to do with the disappearance of many tribes on the southern continent and the flight of many slaves from many islands in the Sonia Sea. He felt that only a matter such as this, which seemed to hold some secrets, could interest Mr. Fool. Of course, it cannot be ruled out that it was an independent act by Mr. Fool's adorer. He couldn't possibly be waiting for everything to be arranged like a manipulated puppet. Alger thought. Capim has something to do with the recent disappearance of the colonial slaves? On second thought, that's not a possibility that can be eliminated. There were 4 Beyonders in his villa, and that in itself isn't normal in the first place. Even if a tycoon like him were to hire Beyonder bodyguards, then he would only be able to get a sequence 7 and 2 sequences 8s or 9s at most. Back then, Horus, together with his mystical items, was equivalent to a sequence 5 expert. The Hanged Man's words jolted Klein's thoughts as he felt that the matter could vaguely be linked together. However, he wasn't sure about his theory, and he could only disregard the Hanged Man's question. He chuckled and said, "My adorer made some minor contributions in this matter." As expected. Audrey's eyes shone brightly as she cheered in her heart. As expected. It's the first time that I encountered anything to do with the Tarot Club in real life. Furs was half happy and half wistful. Alger believed that Mr. Fool's words were an indirect confirmation of his conjecture. Capim was definitely not a simple human trafficker. Otherwise, he wouldn't have caused a hidden existence's adorer to take action. Therefore, there was a strong correlation between the human trafficking and the disappearance of the slaves. Both were matters that weren't simple. Without waiting for Miss Justice to speak, Klein lightly tapped his finger on the edge of the ancient long table and leisurely added, "He obtained 2 Beyonder characteristics from this matter and wishes to sell them as quickly as possible. The 2 characteristics correspond to sequence 8 Sheriff, and the other is sequence 7 Interrogator." Sheriff, Interrogator. Aren't those from the Arbiter pathway which is controlled by the Augustus family? Only members of the royal family, ancient nobles, and the military could possibly acquire them. Capim had one of them backing him? Not excluding the possibility of the Feinapotter Kingdom's Castilla family. Alger frowned, feeling that the disappearance of the slaves wasn't as simple as it seemed. Audrey's thoughts were similar to his. She had never thought that the Beyonders at Capim's villa would be from the Arbiter pathway. It's impossible that the faction in control of the corresponding formulas would collude with a human trafficker like Capim. Audrey pursed her lips slightly, puzzled and confused. Sheriff? Furs, who knew that her good friend, Zio, was saving up for the potion ingredients for this sequence, sat up hurriedly and asked in puzzlement, "Mr. Fool, what are Beyonder characteristics?" "That's not what I expected." "Shouldn't you directly ask me how much it is?" "That's right, I don't think I've ever told Miss Magician about the law of Beyonder characteristics indestructibility and conservation." Klein was taken aback for a moment, and then he began to consider his tone. And at that moment, Audrey spoke out on his behalf. "Mr. Fool, may I answer the question? The corresponding payment shall be paid directly to you." She and Furs are friends, and she had volunteered out of the fear that Mr. Fool wouldn't share that knowledge again. "No problem." Klein smiled in response. Miss Justice is always able to worry about the things that trouble me. He sighed with emotion inwardly. Phew. Audrey breathed a silent sigh of relief and turned to face Furs. She deliberately didn't use the pronunciation and unique vocabulary of a noble to say, "Do you want to know the answer? What are you willing to pay?" Furs nodded without hesitation. Of course. She looked at the figure shrouded in grey fog and respectfully asked, "Mr. Fool, can I use another chapter of the sights in the spirit world as payment?" She specifically emphasized another because she knew that the chapter she would give to Mr. World would be first sacrificed to Mr. Fool, and the knowledge that could be viewed at any time didn't seem to have any value for a transaction. It wasn't to say that she suspected that a mighty figure like Mr. Fool would peak. She just felt that it was more sincere to change the chapter. Sometimes, a mighty figure only cares about your attitude. Furs had read such things in many novels. Leaning back in his chair, Klein replied in an unconcerned tone, "Sure. Thank you, Mr. Fool." Furs said, unable to suppress her smile. She instinctively believed that she had come into contact with certain secret high-level knowledge. Audrey was completely relieved as she smiled faintly. In the Beyonder world, there is a law. Remember, it's a law. In similar pathways, the total Beyonder characteristics are conserved, never reducing or increasing. It will only move from one entity to another, changing from one form to another. Therefore, after the death of a Beyonder, their characteristics will be separated and become equivalent to the main ingredient of a potion. Oh, apart from the remains of rampagers. There are too many latent troubles with those, so they can only be made into items. After the death of a Beyonder, their characteristics will be separated and become equivalent to the main ingredient of a potion? In that instance, it was as if lightning flashed through Furz's mind, allowing her to understand many things. It turns out that the remains Mrs. Alisa left me was her Beyonder characteristic. It turns out that in the eyes of others, every Beyonder is equivalent to walking ingredients. That's really dark. Furs clenched her fists tightly, feeling that the Beyonder world was essentially filled with madness. However, she didn't feel disgusted by the fact that she had become a Beyonder because she had consumed the Beyonder characteristics left behind by Mrs. Alisa. Instead, it gave her a faint sense of warmth. After losing her mother, before she met Zio, Mrs. Alisa was the person who treated her the best. For Furs, it was a sad but warm experience for her to inherit Mrs. Alisa's remains and be with her forever. So that's the case. The law of Beyonder characteristics: indestructibility and conservation. That means the characteristic left behind by a sheriff Beyonder is equivalent to all the main ingredients? Furs asked an additional question to verify her thoughts. Yes. Audrey also thought of Zio. Furs immediately stood up and bowed to the mysterious existence that was looking down at everything. Mr. Fool, can you get your adorer to reserve the sheriff's corresponding Beyonder characteristic? I wish to buy it, but I temporarily lack the funds. Please give me another week, is that fine? Sure. Klein took on an attitude as though he didn't care. Furs heaved a sigh of relief and quickly asked, "How much does your adorer wish to receive in gold pounds?" The price of a corresponding sequence 8 Beyonder ingredient is around 300 pounds. Klein smiled. 600 pounds. After naming the price, he immediately switched topics, showing that he didn't care about a sequence 8 Beyonder characteristic. He looked around and conjured a few goatskin parchments. This is the meaning of a portion of Roselle's secret symbols. It's considered free knowledge, making it easier for you to collect the diary entries in the future. The information included numbers and dates. The reason why Klein had taught the members of the Tarot Club this information was that he was afraid that they would later end up buying counterfeits. With the knowledge of dates, they'll be able to eliminate most counterfeits. Klein chuckled inwardly. Audrey and the others were pleasantly surprised, never expecting to gain such knowledge. Although they had already discovered that the secret symbols on the goatskin were the simplest ones, they all believed that this was a good start. With a first time, there would be a second time and a third time. After a short exchange, Klein said in a gentle tone, "Let us end today's gathering here. By your will." Audrey, Alger, and the others stood up at the same time and bowed. The crimson rays of light dissipated, and the ancient palace above the grey fog returned to its former tranquility. Only Klein was left sitting alone on the high-back chair belonging to the fool. Chapter 396, Pure Light Brotherhood. After returning to the real world, Furs sat at her desk and lost herself in thought about the Abraham family for a while. She had a whole new understanding of the few words mentioned in the mysticism notebooks she had. So that's how it is. It's no wonder Mrs. Alisa didn't wish to inform Mr. Lawrence of her and her husband's death. Now that I think about it, the Abraham family is really pitiful and sad. Furs muttered a few sentences to herself before rummaging and taking out sights in the spirit world from a pile of ordinary books, in preparation to copy the first and second chapters. For this, she entered cogitation and adjusted her breathing in order to be in her optimal condition. Otherwise, just copying the contents of sites in the spirit world would bring her mania and confusion. The words clearly didn't have any spirituality, but once they were combined together to describe those ridiculous scenes, it was as if they had the ability to affect her emotions. I need to take a 5-minute break after every 5 minutes of copying it. I don't want to lose control because of this. Furs took out her small, intrinsic pocket watch and placed it diagonally in front of her desk. In the Berg household in the City of Silver. Derek woke up as a flash of lightning which illuminated everything flashed in his eyes. He looked around, but he didn't feel like he was being monitored. But the hanged man's precise description of the prior events, through reasoning and his deep confidence, convinced him that his conjecture was correct and that there had to be one or more beyonders with particular powers that were secretly monitoring him at that very moment. Besides, Mr. Fool didn't deny it. Derek got out of bed and stretched his body like he usually did. During this process, the analysis and suggestions that the hanged man had given him rapidly surfaced in his mind. Up till now, no one has come looking for you or has chosen to throw you into the dungeons. That's enough to tell us that your chief and the other elders of the 6-member council are still leaning towards observing. They wish to find a way of evacuating the entire City of Silver out of the Forsaken Land through Amon, the first person they've encountered in more than 2,000 years. So, if you don't do anything out of line, they definitely wouldn't rouse you so that Amon wouldn't notice anything amiss. As such, their surveillance wouldn't be too close, physically, at least not when you're awake. And because of this, they probably didn't discover that you've already coughed out that worm of time. Their subsequent reactions are enough to indirectly prove this. Similarly, they should only be able to observe what kind of ritual you held, but they won't be able to figure out who you're praying to. If it were me, I would definitely suspect that it was related to Amon. Due to the above reasons, you can openly hold the bestowment ritual. After all of this, you can push the blame onto Amon. Of course, you have to pretend to be sufficiently cautious and careful. You have to be prepared to undergo the examination of a psyche analyst and other beyonders of other sequences when everything is over. Regarding this matter, you can seek Mr. Fool for help. With the hanged man's suggestion, Derek walked around the table twice, carefully closed the window, lit a candle, and set up a bestowment ritual. Above the grey fog, within the towering, ancient palace. Klein was staring idly at the stone pillars that supported the dome, feeling that the building he had willed resembled an Athens temple. Is it because of my own subconscious? His thoughts wandered. At that moment, the dark red star corresponding to the sun began to emit light, and it quickly dispersed the ripples to form an illusory and mysterious door. Above the grey fog, a small amount of power was stirred up as it flowed like water. Upon hearing the stacked pleas, Klein lowered his head and looked at the all-black eye placed in front of him. Let's hope little son doesn't lose this. Otherwise, Mr. World would have to be gloriously sacrificed. It was precisely because he had the all-black eye that Klein, who wasn't a nimble-right master, could secretly control the world as a fake person, allowing him to act as if he was made of flesh and blood. Once the item was lost, he would have to let the world die to prevent the magic from getting exposed. While sighing, Klein emanated his spirituality, stirring the power of the fog into flowing towards the illusory door, forcefully pushing it open slightly and stabilizing the transmission channel. Soon after, he placed the all-black eye into an iron box and threw it into the gap of the mysterious door. He casually said, "Do not touch the item inside." After doing all this, he didn't stay any longer, because he knew that little son wouldn't be able to find an opportunity to take action that quickly, and he was unsure when Miss Magician would be able to finish copying the 2 chapters of Sights in the Spirit World. Relaxing his spirituality, Klein's figure disappeared from the space above the gray fog. In the Berg household in the City of Silver. As soon as Derek saw an iron-black box on the altar, he heard Mr. Fool's familiar voice, "Do not touch the item inside. Do not touch." Derek made a note of this reminder and decided to carry it out to a T. After thanking the Fool and Mr. World and ending the bestowment ritual, he opened the box with extraordinary care and examined the contents. It was a completely black eye without a pupil. Just looking at it threw his mind into chaos, and his thoughts became sluggish. Faint, indistinct, and seemingly crazy ravings sounded in his ears. After a sudden shiver ran through his body, Derek closed the lid of the iron box, picked up a silver dagger, and completely sealed the iron box with a wall of spirituality. Then, he put the iron box into a secret pocket on the inside of his clothes, fixed the axe of Hurricane in place and left the room, heading straight for the training field. The exploration team members were still under the disguised quarantine. However, Derek had no plans to take action today. He carefully followed Mr. Hanged Man's instructions and planned to observe the situation first and patiently wait for an opportunity. Of course, if there was a good opportunity, he would have to act decisively. Upon entering the training field, Derek circled around the exploration team's area and saw that they were gathered in groups of 2 or 3, whispering to each other, but once they noticed that someone was watching, they would immediately stop and stand there in silence. At times, they would take a few steps, like zombies that had just crawled out of the darkness. What would they do if I removed the wall of spirituality now and allow them to sense the feelings emanated by Mr. World's item? Will they turn their heads at the same time to look at me? Derek imagined the scene of everyone turning their heads and looking at him with cold and emotionless eyes, and he felt a baffling, indescribable fear. He drew a breath and told himself to be patient, to wait, and not to panic. City of Silver, at the top of the spire, in a room that belonged to the chief. Demon hunter Colin Iliad, who was resting his mind with his eyes closed, looked towards a dark corner. A human figure stood up from the ground with a twisted posture. It swayed slightly and said with a voice that sounded like metal abrasions, "Your Excellency, Derek Berg has held another ritual. According to my observation, it's likely to be a bestowment request ritual. It's very similar to the sacrificial rituals we usually hold, but what's different is that he received a response and was given an iron-black box. I couldn't exactly see what was inside, but it gave me a very evil and dangerous feeling." At this point, the shadow urgently pleaded, "Your Excellency, it's definitely directed by that mysterious person. We have to take action and not let this continue unheeded. Otherwise, Derek Berg will summon an evil god or a similar existence sooner or later, destroying the entire City of Silver." Colin's expression became unusually grave. He stood up and slowly paced up and down, saying, "Let's wait a little longer. Up till now, we still haven't figured out the purpose of that mysterious person who called himself Amon. We don't understand why he only sent one avatar to the City of Silver after discovering it, as well as the goal of patiently staying in the underground dungeons for 42 years. If his intention is solely to destroy us, he wouldn't have done such incomprehensible actions. Just wait a little longer. This might be our hidden hope, the hope for us in surviving the apocalypse when it comes. Just as he finished his sentence, a bolt of lightning flashed past the window, illuminating the pitch-black sky and the gloomy room. When it was almost evening, Klein finally received Miss Magician's prayer and obtained the first 2 chapters of Sights in the Spirit World through the sacrificial ritual. When he sat in the seat that belonged to the fool, he leisurely flipped through the copied notebook, and he read them, line by line. He was stunned to find himself turning increasingly irritable. What's happening? Those words clearly don't contain any spirituality, and the paper is ordinary as well. It couldn't be a sealed artifact, so how can it affect my state of mind? Furthermore, I'm above the gray fog, a fog that can even sever the influence of a true God. Klein frowned, leaned back, and carefully recalled the information in the Book of Secrets which had similar phenomena. Not long after, he roughly understood the reason. When certain existences were described in detail, even if it was written in text form, it would still affect the reader's thoughts and psyche. Amongst them, the scariest were records related to true gods. A book explaining a particular god in detail would cause every reader to go crazy or even distort their ideologies. As for Beyonders, there was a high chance of them losing control. Sights in the Spirit World was written by a certain ancestor of the Abraham family. He had recorded all the strange and wonderful things that happened when he traveled through the Spirit World. In the first chapter, he described the lights in the Spirit World. He believed that the 7 rays of pure light of different colors contained the limitless knowledge of different domains, and that no matter where the travelers were in the Spirit World, they would be able to see them blanketing higher elevations. What was even more surprising was that these 7 rays of light were alive. They were like spirit bodies that lingered there. In the field of mysticism, many of the secret deed rituals were actually aimed at the 7 pure lights, and through their secret connections, they allowed one to gain a certain amount of knowledge. Therefore, many mysticism experts called the 7 pure lights master or teacher. In response to this, the 7 pure lights seemed very happy. They had even pulled quite a few spirit world creatures to form a secret organization that specialized in teaching people, the Pure Light Brotherhood. In the second chapter, the traveler from the Abraham family recorded his encounter with the yellow light, Venathan. Chapter 397, Apocalyptic Prophecy. Relying on the power of the mysterious space above the gray fog, Klein quickly recovered a good state of mind and continued to read the second chapter of the Sights in the Spirit World. The traveler of the Abraham family, the owner of the notebook, claimed that when he wandered into the depths of the spirit world, he met an elder dressed in lemon-yellow robes. The elder's body was translucent and was abnormally similar to the surrounding creatures of the spirit world, but his attitude was surprisingly amiable. The traveler from the Abraham family conversed with the elder for a while, and he was surprised to find out that the elder was actually one of the 7 pure lights that blanketed the spirit world at the highest elevation, yellow light, Venathan. Venathan told the traveler of the Abraham family that his own characteristics were reason and adaptation, that he was the symbol of astromancy, and that his corresponding gem was emerald. He made a rather anxious reference to a prophecy that came from himself. Focus as the stars fall from the cosmos, shattering the lands. Everything in the world will cease to exist. He believed that this would be the end of the world within 200 years. Nothing would be spared from this. The traveler from the Abraham family didn't have much of a reaction towards this comment. Instead, he asked how he could remove the bloodline curse of his family. Yellow light, Venathan told him that in a certain sense, it was indeed a curse, but it had a completely different nature from the curses in mysticism. The solution was in the future, in the hands of an apprentice who was assisted by a hidden existence. He also warned the traveler of the Abraham family that the day the curse was lifted was the beginning of the Abraham family's true doom. As for what the tribulation was, he said that he wasn't so sure himself. He believed that it involved a great existence on the level of gods. In the second chapter of Sights in the Spirit World, the owner of the notebook mentioned something else. Venathan mentioned another matter. The rulers of the Great White Brotherhood would often enter the real world, and through different methods, transform into humans and teach the knowledge of their respective domains. Since the fifth epoch, many of the mentor-level characters of different domains were their incarnations. For example, the greatest astrologer, D. Forsman, in the last 1,000 years had proved that their current world was a planet. He was none other than the human incarnation of Yellow Light, Venethan. Based on this, the owner of the notebook raised a theory. Which Pure Light's incarnation was Roselle Gustave, who could be considered a mentor in many fields. No, he wasn't. If you really want to think like that, then he's probably a green light. Klein raised his hand and rubbed his temples. Based on this, he judged that the owner of the notebook wasn't an extremely ancient beyonder. However, judging from the fact that the person didn't address Roselle as emperor, this tour of the spirit world had likely taken place during the period when Roselle was still a consul, or when his proclamation as an emperor was still not widely recognized. Of course, it didn't prevent the possibility that beyonders of the Abraham family refused to recognize any emperor other than the Tudor emperor. A traveler who can roam the spirit world. It must be quite a high sequence. If he were a high-sequence beyonder, Mr. Dorr would have long been rescued, and the so-called bloodline curse would no longer exist. Thus, the owner of the diary would be a sequence 5 beyonder or a sequence 6 with a mystical item. Although the Abraham family has declined, they aren't weak either. Why is Yellow Light Venethan's prophecy similar to that of the Demonist sect and the Aurora Order? The apocalypse is coming? From the period that I predicted, the apocalypse should only be 2 to 3 decades from now? Klein frowned as he thought. Roselle became consul in 1173, and it was currently November 1349, 176 years away, and Yellow Light Venethan had predicted back then that it would be within 200 years. Considering the fact that Klein had only made an estimate of the period interval, it was possible that he was 24 to 50 years from the apocalypse. Roselle proclaimed himself as emperor in 1192 and was assassinated in 1198. Although the first 2 chapters of Sights in the Spirit World didn't provide any practical knowledge, it had thoroughly opened up his sights, allowing him to understand the situation of the spirit world to a certain extent, as well as the existence of the 7 pure lights and the Great White Brotherhood. So, when advancing, the pure lights seen at extremely high elevations after transforming into a spirit body state and holding the corresponding ritual are the pure lights of the spirit world. Furthermore, they are alive with their own thoughts. How miraculous! The first 2 chapters of Sights in the Spirit World aren't completely lacking practical knowledge. At the very least, I know that Yellow Light's real name is Venethan and that his corresponding gem is Emerald. I got to learn a lot of detailed information, and I can use this to design secret deed rituals that point towards him. But for the time being, it wouldn't be of much use. Klein thought for a moment, then he closed the copied notebook and returned to the real world. He had more important things to do instead of communicating with Yellow Light Venethan. Klein took out a piece of paper, raised his pen, and wrote a letter to the inventor, Leopard, asking what stage of the patent approval process the bicycle was, why it hadn't been successful, and if he needed a lawyer to help him. With the establishment of the magician's rules, the thorough digestion of the potion wouldn't take him more than 2 months, and he had to save up as quickly as possible for the corresponding costs of the beyonder ingredients that are needed for him to advance to a faceless. Of these, the Sun might be able to offer one item for free because of the all-black eye, but the other item required Klein to figure it out for himself. As far as he knew, the corresponding beyonder ingredients for Sequence 6 were all over £1,500 and were typically in a situation where demand stripped supply. In addition to the 2 main ingredients, the supplementary ingredients included the blood of a 1,000-faced hunter and the hair from a deep-sea naga. These 2 items were extremely rare and rich in spirituality, making them expensive. Earning money really is difficult, but spending it is easy. If only I could sell the werewolf and interrogator beyonder characteristics. I can't even waste a single penny or solely. Klein sealed the envelope and adhered a stamp on it. He knew how much he had without even needing to count. £624 in notes and 5 £1 gold coins, plus 7 solely notes and some copper pennies. Right. Miss Magician will pay £600 for the Sheriff Beyonder characteristic meant for Miss Zio. I hope they can raise the money as soon as possible. Klein silently cheered the two ladies on. You're telling me that a Beyonder circle you recently joined has both Beyonder ingredients of the Sheriff potion, and the price is very reasonable. £600 for all of it? Zio widened her eyes as she delivered a barrage of questions. She had just come back from East Borough to find out who had recently been keeping tabs on Capim. Yes, he's a very reputable seller. The only problem is that the verification process for joining is very strict, so I won't be able to rope you in for a short period of time. What Furs said was entirely the truth. That's great. Zio didn't suspect her friend, but she took 2 excited steps forward. Suddenly, her expression sank. But, I don't have enough money. The corners of Furs's lips twitched as she asked, how much do you have now? Counting the £30 deposit received from this job, a total of £310, so I'm still short of half. Zio scratched her short blonde hair. Let me think of where I can borrow £300. The bank won't give a bounty hunter like me a loan, and those usuries have way too much interest. Perhaps Miss Audrey? She had heard from her friend that she had recently bought the Trickmaster potion recipe for £450, so she had no intention of borrowing money from Furs. Why are we all so poor? Furs couldn't help but sigh. Miss Audrey rarely comes out these days. She seems to be busy with other things, and borrowing money from her isn't always a timely thing to do. We can try Viscount Glaint first. If it's too late, then I'll help you pay for the rest. I have £430, that's enough. Zio blinked her eyes and suddenly lowered her head. She said in a heavy voice, Furs, you're the best. When I advance to Sheriff, I'll earn even more money. Furs smiled and shook her head. So, why don't you do the cleaning today? How about that? City of Silver. Derek left the training field and returned home. He had just inquired about when the exploratory team members would be released from quarantine, and he had received the answer, when the lightning comes today. Sitting down at an ancient wooden table, Derek considered the plan again, remembering Mr. Hanged Man's reminder, if there's no suitable audience to testify for you, then you might as well use the Beyonder who's monitoring you. But how do I know when I'm being monitored? Mr. Hanged Man said it with great certainty, but he wasn't detailed enough. Many questions arose in Derek, but he couldn't find a way to verify them. Although he felt embarrassed to ask Mr. Fool for guidance on this question, upon considering the fact that this matter was related to the survival of the City of Silver, he mustered his courage. He spoke the name of the Fool in a low voice, and he briefly described the difficulties he had encountered. After a while, he saw Mr. Fool sitting in the middle of the endless grey fog. He heard a concise reply, touch the item in the iron box. Do not exceed 3 heartbeats. Prepare yourself in advance. Pay attention to the origins of the black lines. That simple? Derek thanked Mr. Fool in pleasant surprise. He adjusted his posture and quietly put his hand into the inside pocket of his clothes. As the wall of spirituality was lifted, Derek's fingers pushed open the iron box and carefully probed inside. Suddenly, he touched an ice-cold item, and the black illusory lines appeared in front of his eyes. At the same time, his mind buzzed, as if an illusory roar was tearing through his ears. Derek's body convulsed, and tears and snot streamed down his face due to the pain. He almost forgot what he had to do, but fortunately, in the limits of his vision, he saw the illusory black lines converge. In that dark corner, there appeared to be a shadow. Derek withdrew his hand at once, as though he had touched a red-hot soldering iron. He collapsed to the ground and began to twitch as if he had been struck by lightning. His mouth couldn't close at all, and saliva constantly dripped from it. It took nearly a minute for Derek to recover, close the box again, and seal it with a wall of spirituality. He stood up and took a sip of cold water, already aware that someone was monitoring him at that very moment. After an unknown period of time, Derek suddenly heard a knock on the door. "Who is it?" he asked, slightly at a loss. A jovial voice came from outside. "It's me, Dark. The exploratory team has been removed from quarantine. Weren't you interested in knowing about our experience this time?" Chapter 398, Alluring Mushrooms. Dark. The image of Dark appeared in Derek's mind. He was of medium height, slightly plump, and strong. He was an optimistic, cheerful teenager who often beamed with a friendly smile. He was a classmate during general education and a teammate of the patrol squad. But after this exploration of the fallen creator's half-destroyed temple, he had become reserved and merely smiled at everyone. Once he recalled Dark Regence's changes, Derek couldn't help but quiver as he felt a chill down his spine. Why did he suddenly come looking for me? Shouldn't he be heading home after being removed from quarantine? At that moment, many questions arose in Derek's mind. Suddenly, he thought of a possibility. Elder Lovia knows that I've suspected that something abnormal had happened to them, so she sent Dark to deal with me? Derek was first shocked and filled with horror. But immediately following that, he felt that it might not be a bad thing. Mr. Hanged Man said, "If there isn't a suitable audience to testify for you, then you might as well use the Beyonder who's monitoring you. And now, the person monitoring me is in that corner. If Dark were to suddenly attack me, then he would definitely expose the fact that there's something wrong with him. This way, even if I don't use Mr. World's item, I can still make things go smoothly." Derek turned his head to look out the window. At that moment, the frequency of the lightning had dropped to its nadir. Only after a minute or two would a bolt of lightning streak across the sky, illuminating half the sky. The entire world and most of the city of Silver was immersed in a deep darkness most of the time. If he were alone, Derek wouldn't have searched for a candle to light. He liked to lie quietly in bed and think about all sorts of things. Of course, he knew that this was actually rather dangerous. If there was no light to dispel the darkness, then monsters could suddenly appear, even within the city of Silver. However, Derek was a light suppliant himself, so he came equipped with the attribute of light and wasn't afraid of something similar happening. Knock. 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 Dark knocked 3 more times, as if urging the master of the house to open the door. He wasn't like that before, he was very polite. Derek suddenly felt a deep sense of sorrow. He took out a candle from a wooden box and placed it in the middle of the table. He then rubbed his fingers, creating a golden flame. The flame lit the candle, filling the room with a faint but warm glow, and this was accompanied by a faint, pungent aroma. The candles in the city of Silver were mainly made from the fat and oil refined from the bodies of monsters. They would have different smells due to their different origins. After taking a deep breath, Derek walked to the door with a strong sense of vigilance and opened it. "What took you so long?" Dark asked with a smile. "I was looking for candles," Derek replied. He didn't dare to leave his back to the other party, and he chose to walk side by side with Dark. With his classmate and teammate, he walked back to the table and took their respective seats. "Do you want to try some of these recently dried doom fruits?" Dark asked with a smile as he removed a small cloth bag from his waist. Doom fruits were one of the very rare snacks in the city of Silver. It came from a plant called the Doom Blood Vine, a type of organism that didn't need light to grow. It grew by absorbing the nutrients from rotten corpses. It had a tendency to attack and was considered quite a common weak monster. Every Doom Blood Vine had many thumb-sized black fruits, which could be eaten directly. They were crispy and sweet, but they were unable to fill one's stomach and didn't provide the necessary nutrients. They could only be used as a daily snack. The merit points received from a single patrol could be exchanged for several large bags of them. No, there's no need. Derek shook his head cautiously. All right then. Dark poured out a pile of black fruit from the bag, picked one up, and popped it into his mouth before noisily munching on it. Derek thought for a moment and took the initiative to ask, "Did you encounter any monsters in the underground area of the temple?" Dark stopped chewing and answered with a smile, "There were quite a few of them, but they weren't that powerful. They were easily eliminated by us. That place was destroyed for a long time, so the powerful monsters probably left a long time ago." He paused for a second, then he said with the corners of his mouth curled, "We found some strange plants at the bottom of the temple. They looked like mushrooms in the general knowledge class. They were especially bright and looked very appetizing. It's been confirmed that they're edible. They can bring about an enhancement in one's spirituality and strengthen one's body. If it's combined with roasted monsters, then it will emit an unimaginable fragrance." As he said that, he took out a palm-sized mushroom-shaped object from another small cloth bag. The stem was milky white, and the cap was bright crystalline red. It was also dotted with dark golden spots. The mere sight of the plant made Derek gulp a mouthful of saliva, as though he had been starving for days. Under the illumination of the dim candlelight, the beautiful mushroom-shaped object had an alluring luster that whet his appetite in an irresistible fashion. "Here's one for you." Dark smiled warmly. Okay. Derek almost took action immediately as he picked up the mushroom-shaped plant to stuff it into his mouth, but in the end, he forced himself to open his mouth and say, "I'll give it a try tomorrow." Dark didn't say anything else. He pushed the mushroom in front of Derek and continued to eat his doom fruits. With great difficulty, Derek moved his gaze away from the mushroom and asked, "Did you make any discoveries on this expedition?" "Yes." Dark paused his snack eating and held a black doom fruit, replying extremely seriously, "We found a lot of murals, a continuous series of murals." "Do you remember that statue in the temple?" "Yes." Derek shot a glance at the mushroom and nodded. A huge cross with a naked man nailed to it while hanging upside down, and its surface was deliberately smeared with a lot of blood. Dark fiddled with the doom fruit in his hand and said, "The newly discovered murals tell us that the builders of the temple believed that the statue represented the Lord who created everything, the omnipotent and omniscient God. They believed that the Lord didn't abandon this land, but instead helped us shoulder the vast majority of our sins when the cataclysm came, thus, turning from an upright position to upside down, from walking freely to being nailed to the cross and bleeding in our stead. God's grace knows no bounds. We are not the abandoned, but instead, the beloved chosen ones. Without the Lord bearing our sins and shedding blood in our stead, the city of silver would have been destroyed long ago. Humans would have long ceased to exist. But, in the outside world, in the lone kingdom where Mr. Hanged Man, Miss Justice, and the others are located, there are no curses, no extreme darkness, no monsters lurking in darkness. We aren't the chosen ones who are beloved." Derek silently retorted inwardly. "If that's true, then we just need to change the symbols and the corresponding honorific name during a ritual, and we can receive the Lord's response again," Dark went on, describing the murals under the temple and speaking of his speculations. As this went on, Derek found it increasingly difficult to resist the temptation of the mushroom. "No, I mustn't eat it. If I eat it, I might end up like Dark and the others, completely corrupted by the fallen creator and become a fanatical believer. Even if there's someone monitoring me, they wouldn't notice anything amiss." Derek felt a surge of horror that he had to do something to extricate himself from the situation. Chase Dark away and return the mushroom to him? However, this is equivalent to giving up on this opportunity. Opportunity. Derek's gaze automatically fell on the yellow candle flame that was burning quietly. "I'll get you a glass of water." He quickly went through the plan he had discussed with Mr. Hanged Man and calmly stood up. Dark nodded as he threw the black thumb-sized doom fruit into his mouth, munching at it noisily. While Derek poured the water, he deliberately slowed down his actions, lowered his head, and recited the honorific name of Mr. Fool. Finally, he said, "Your devoted servant prays for your attention. I pray for you to take his offerings. I pray for you to open the gates to your kingdom." Whoosh! A strong gust of wind blew up inside the room as the power of nature, generated under the incantation's influence, formed clear waves. At the same time, Dark, who had just picked up a black doom fruit, suddenly raised his head and looked at Derek, who was facing him from the side. What happened? Without answering him, Derek held one hand over the axe of Hurricane and stuffed the other into his secret pocket, removing the wall of spirituality on the exterior of the iron box. Derek cast an exceptionally guarded gaze at Dark, only to see the expression of his classmate and teammate darken as bright red traces appeared in his blue eyes. In his hand, the doom fruit strangely shed its outer darkness and transformed into a seemingly pale, fleshy color. It wasn't a doom fruit, but a finger, a bloody finger, a human finger. The pile of doom fruits on the table were comprised of human fingers. The brightly colored mushroom had also changed its appearance. It was no longer as beautiful, and it no longer flowed with an appetizing luster. It was a blood-stained scalp with short black hair. Staring at Derek, Dark opened his mouth, his voice cold and adrift. "What were you doing?" Backlund, 15 Minsk Street. As soon as Klein, who had crawled into the warm world under his quilt, heard what sounded like a prayer from Little Sun, he struggled to get out of bed and conjured a wall of spirituality. He then took 4 steps counterclockwise and went above the gray fog. Seated in the seat that belonged to the Fool, he didn't hurry to examine Little Sun's request. Instead, he made the Dark Emperor card, paper figurines, and other items appear in front of him on the long bronze table in a neatly arranged order. According to the Hanged Man's plan, the scene of the sun stimulating the mutation of the exploratory team's member would happen during a sacrificial ritual. That way, when the matter was concluded, it would be quite simple to make the object, that was borrowed from the world, disappear from the scene, wiping away all the evidence. After that, all the blame could be pushed onto Amon. As for Mr. Fool, Klein had agreed to Little Sun's request to simplify the ritual in an uncaring manner. All that was needed to be done were the key steps. At this point, he was waiting for the prelude to the ritual to be completed so that he could respond. Chapter 399, The Corrupted in the Berg Household in the City of Silver. Looking at the blood-stained scalp, Derek suddenly recalled what it previously looked like. It was a beautiful and alluring mushroom, one that he almost couldn't control himself from swallowing. The doom fruits, that Dark had shared with him and produced crisp, crunchy sounds when they were bitten into, were actually bloody pieces of human fingers with slightly pale skin. At that moment, Derek had a violent spasm in his stomach before a gush of acid surged to his throat. Resisting the urge to vomit, he quickly croaked a line of lyrics, "God, please have your kingdom descend upon this land. Your enemies will disperse, and your followers will relish in joy." There was a touch of warmth and holiness in the song, and Derek felt all the discomfort in his body weaken. His spirituality also became full and lively. His courage, his strength, and his agility were all greatly enhanced by this song. That was the beyonder powers of a Sequence 9 bard. Dark stared at his former classmate and teammate singing with an increasingly dark expression. The way he spoke became more and more inhuman. "What is that thing on your body? What is that thing on your body? What is that thing on your body?" All of a sudden, Dark's clothes were stretched out in bugling strips, as though a nest of slithering venomous snakes was underneath them. Whoosh! Bloody strips of flesh pierced through the black skin-tight clothing, and its surface had rough skin covered with hair. Strands of meat began to flail outwards, causing Dark to look like a bloody, furry hedgehog. With a swoosh, the meat strands surged towards Derek, who was still standing at his original location. Derek was a patrol squad member who had seen quite a number of monsters, so he wasn't too flustered by this situation. He twisted his waist, raised his arm, and swung the axe of hurricane that he was already holding in his hand. Oof! The axe of hurricane hacked down at a few bloody strands of flesh, directly splitting them in half and causing them to fall to the ground. However, because it was nighttime in the City of Silver, this strike didn't bring about any lightning. Even more bloody strips of flesh began to surge forward, wrapping themselves around the axe of hurricane over and over again as they relentlessly clung to it. Seeing that his weapon couldn't be pulled back, a pure light suddenly lit up in Derek's eyes. It was as if two small suns had descended into the room, and his other hand was holding something close to his mouth and nose as if he was praying. Without a sound, a fiery pillar of pure light descended from the sky, striking the bloody flesh that was wound up into a ball. Dark let out an uncontrollable scream, and many bloody strips of flesh fell to the ground, charred black. They squirmed, struggling as if they were alive. The spirituality contained within these bloody strips of meat was no longer under the control of its original owner, and gradually, they merged with the natural power derived from the sacrificial ritual's incantation, forming an increasingly bright pink wave. This wave surged into the dim yellow candle flame, causing the light to suddenly burgeon, forming an illusory and mysterious door. Derek had long drawn the fool's secret symbol on the candle. This was all prepared in advance. All of this constituted a simple but complete sacrifice ceremony. Gotcha! As the seat shattered, Dark lunged at Derek while flailing the bloody strips of meat. There was no fear or tension in his eyes, only the purest, most fervent desire. At this moment, Klein, who was above the fog, responded. With a creaking sound, the illusory door that had many strange patterns on it opened a tiny crack. Behind the crack was a deep darkness in which countless transparent and indescribable shadows resided. High above these shadows were 7 pure lights of different colors that contained endless knowledge. Above the brilliance was an endless grayish-white fog, and above it was an ancient palace that overlooked the gray fog. Suddenly, a shadow leaped out from a dark corner, covering Dark who was closest to him. Dark's flailing strips of bloody meat were all wrapped up by pitch-black, viscous liquid as he seemed to turn into a cat who had entered an opaque bag. The shadow didn't stop, and it quickly extended across the ground, rushing towards Derek, who had already dodged to another location, and shouted sternly, "Stop! What are you trying to do?" As an observer, his original plan was to watch from the sidelines and record the corresponding anomalies. He would only take action to stop the two strange parties when the situation became unmanageable. But when he saw the illusory door covered with strange symbols open up with a crack, he felt intimidated by the deep, mysterious, distant, and majestic scene inside. He instinctively believed that this was related to a terrifying evil god, so he could only take hasty actions, giving orders in an attempt to forcefully interrupt Derek's attempts at performing a sacrifice to that being. However, Derek had already chosen his location to be as far from the shadow as possible, therefore, to stop the boy who was possessed by the mysterious Amon, the shadow observer had to bypass or take down Derek Regents first. However, his choice was the latter. Because of the obvious abnormality with Dark. Leaving his back to this being was an absolutely stupid move. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Derek took out the iron box from his concealed pocket and threw it towards the illusory door conjured by the candle flame, towards the crack that presented a magical scene. As the iron box disappeared, the door, that was covered in strange symbols and characteristics, closed with a clang, before quickly vanishing. At this moment, Derek remembered Mr. Hanged Man's words, and he deliberately warped his facial muscles and savagely moved towards the shadow. Before the shadow blanketed him, he suddenly coughed violently and covered his mouth with his hand before falling to the ground. The pitch-black shadow emanated and completely covered him. The room returned to silence, but there were now 2 huge black chrysalises on the ground. After a while, the pitch-black, viscous liquid withdrew and reformed into a shadow. With the chrysalis, the silhouettes of Derek and Dark appeared once more. The former lay there unconscious, but a tiny, strange worm with 12 transparent rings dropped from his hand. The latter had already turned into a lump of flesh, squirming and roaring as it prepared to attack. Faced with this situation, the observer had no choice but to spare some of his strength and once again wrapped him up, using his shadow-like black liquid to envelop Dark Regents, who had transformed into a monster. Glancing at the scattered pale fingers and the bloody scalp with short black hair, the observer couldn't help but take a deep breath. Using his Beyonder powers to control the shadows outside, he created tidal waves to inform the chief inside the spire. Only after doing this did he carefully examine Derek's situation and saw the strange, translucent worm. "This, the avatar that Amon hid in Derek's body is dead," the observer muttered in surprise. As he recalled Dark's strangeness, the terrifying mutation, and the mushroom and doom fruits, he began to have a rough idea of what had happened. Perhaps Amon was archenemies with the mastermind behind Dark's corruption. In order to foil the other party's ploy, Amon was willing to sacrifice his avatar. Derek's visit to the training field to observe the exploratory team and his report of them to the chief were both Amon's attempts to rid his enemy without exposing himself. The mastermind behind Dark's corruption had noticed Derek's strangeness, so he sent Dark to take control of him. The bloody scalp and fingers were props to achieve his goal. As he thought of this, the Monitor suddenly agreed with the chief's concern. The apocalypse or an even greater disaster was about to befall the City of Silver. That was why the City of Silver would repeatedly encounter so many strange events and mysterious existences that lurked deep in the darkness. Inside the chief's room at the spire, the shadow recounted everything that had happened. The grizzled, facially scarred Colin Iliad nodded gently after hearing the recount. Derek, or should I say, Amon, had really prepared ahead of time. The candle with the symbol engraved on it, the evil object that can expose Dark's problem, and Derek's excuse of pouring water to whisper a prayer, as well as finally sending away the item in a sacrificial ritual, all of this indicates that the entire situation developed according to his plan. 2 questions. 1. Who does the hidden symbol on the candle refer to? Amon himself or the god behind him? 2. Why is Amon willing to expose the exploratory team's abnormality at the cost of his avatar? Is it because he's archenemies with the mastermind? Then, why did he stay in the City of Silver for 42 years? Could it be that he foretold this matter ahead of time, which is why he specifically met with the exploratory team from 42 years ago and planted his avatar in them so as to foil the plans of that mastermind? He waited 42 years for that single moment. Upon hearing the chief's questions, the shadow observer suddenly said in enlightenment, "Maybe that's how it is. Your Excellency, think about it. Why would Amon patiently wait for 42 years before making Udal lose control when Derek was imprisoned beside him? It's because the foretold time was approaching, and he was in desperate need to switch to a free person that he can latch onto so as to foil the plans of that mastermind." Indeed. We were only thinking about what was different with Derek, and we didn't pay attention to the timing, the City of Silver's chief Colin answered in thought. The shadow observer immediately said, "Your Excellency, please immediately lock down all members of the exploratory team. They're definitely problematic. Also, Elder Lovia, she has a non-trivial possibility of also being corrupted." Colin frowned and said, "Before you reported this matter to me, and even before Dark went out, Lovia came to me and told me that she suspects that the members of the exploratory team had been contaminated by something. She recommended that we secretly monitor them and if necessary, have them guard Elder Hoyk's inverted mausoleum." Hoyk was the former chief of the City of Silver, and he had built himself a mausoleum. After that, he lived in that mausoleum, and his appearances began to slowly decrease. Finally, the doors were closed, impossible to open again. Elder Lovia had long mentioned of an abnormality, the shadow observer asked in surprise. After receiving a positive answer, he muttered to himself, half doubtful and half relaxed, "It's good that Elder Lovia doesn't have any problems. I've already sent people to lock down the members of the exploratory team, but we can't ignore any other possibilities." Chief Colin let out a sigh. "Let Aflor come to me. I'll interrogate Derek Berg together with her." Chapter 400, The Growth of the Rookie. In a dark and sturdy room, Derek Berg, who had feigned unconsciousness, suddenly rolled to his feet. His axe of hurricane had already been taken away by someone and sent for inspection. Every pocket on him had also been emptied out, leaving nothing behind. Derek took a breath and looked around steadily. Suddenly, his eyes lit up with two sun-like beams, causing everything in the room to be reflected clearly in his eyes. The furniture here consisted of only a table and two chairs. Apart from these, there was also a stone-paved floor with strange patterns on it. A half-used candle was placed on the table. This was standard issue for rooms in the City of Silver because monsters could suddenly appear if the darkness prevailed for too long. Without any hesitation, Derek sat down and reached for the candle. Then, he broke the candle and divided it into 3 sections. One was 3/4 the length of the original piece, and the other 2 were halved from the remaining quarter. After Derek's modification, the 3 candlesticks' cores were completely exposed. "Pa!" He rubbed his fingers together, creating a golden flame that lit up the 3 candles. The 2 at the top represented Mr. Fool, and the remaining 1 symbolized Derek himself. After finishing his preparations, Derek didn't continue to burn the herbal powder according to the normal processes. Instead, he poured in the essential oil and leaned back, softly chanting the honorific name of the Fool, and quickly entered cogitation. He read it over and over again, monotonously, as if he were hypnotizing himself. With the help of cogitation, Derek entered a strange state where his mind was in a deep sleep and the spirituality was dispersing. He felt adrift, but also seemed to maintain a strange lucidity. His psyche kept dispersing upwards as it rose in height. This was artificial sleepwalking. Derek, with the permission of Mr. Fool, could simplify some of the unnecessary steps. Above the grey fog, within the towering, ancient palace, Klein, who was fiddling with the all-black eye, suddenly saw the crimson star that symbolized Little Sun burgeon with light, condensing into a human shadow, and the power of the mysterious space was stirred a little. Upon seeing this, he couldn't help but feel relieved. This meant that Little Sun had already completed the relatively dangerous part of the operation, and he only needed to round up the situation. Klein didn't delay, and he immediately put down the all-black eye and picked up the Dark Emperor card. He instantly rose in level and authority, forcing the stirred power in the grey fog to submit to him. Then, he picked up a paper figurine, flicked his wrist, and threw it towards the crimson star corresponding to the sun. The paper figurine and the flowing power intertwined and quickly expanded into a gigantic angel with 12 pairs of pitch-black wings. The angel pierced through the crimson light and overlapped with the illusory figure of Little Sunday. It silently combusted, turning into ashes in less than a second. At this point, Klein could no longer affect the situation of the City of Silver. As for whether his angel substitute could help Little Sun pass the subsequent inquiries and investigations, he lacked absolute confidence. He could only sigh inwardly. With what has to be done completed and with all the hard work put in, all you can do is wait for fate's arrangement. Hopefully, it will be a good result. In a daze, Derek saw an angel descend before him with an aura that covered the heavens, wrapping him with 12 pairs of black wings. He suddenly came to his senses as 3 candles burned quietly in front of his eyes. After sincerely thanking Mr. Fool, Derek finished the ritual and extinguished the 2 candles which were part of the original quarter. Then, he pulled them out and created a bright, golden flame in his palm. Drip, drip, drip. The 2 candles quickly melted, dripping its wax onto the remaining candle or the area surrounding it. When the candle burnt away completely, there was only one candle left on the table. It was shorter than before, but it wasn't very obvious. It seemed like it had only been burning for a short time. After removing the remaining traces, Derek extinguished the last yellow-flamed candle. He sat up in silence, staring ahead. For a long time, he didn't do anything. He was worried that the 6-member council wouldn't react fast enough, allowing the exploratory team members to corrupt more residents of the City of Silver with mushrooms and doom fruits. He was afraid that the chief and the others would find additional clues elsewhere, thwarting all his preparations. He hated those outsiders who lurked in the depths of the darkness, constantly carrying strong malice, including Amon and the fallen creator. He felt guilty that he had avoided the expedition without warning Dark and the rest, causing them to turn into corrupted monsters. He had painfully eliminated a classmate who could be considered a friend with his own hands. Although Derek didn't see Dark's ultimate end, he believed that a man who had transformed into that state was already no different from dead. Derek didn't know how long he waited while experiencing those mixed feelings. Midway, he even rekindled the candle. Finally, he heard the sound of the seal being removed and the door opening. Turning his head to look, he saw, with the aid of the dim yellow candlelight, a woman in a black skirt walk in. She had her hair tied up in a ponytail and it hung down to her vest. "Ma'am Aflor," Derek subconsciously called out. Aflor was a pretty woman, but she had wrinkles at the corners of her eyes. She smiled and nodded in response, then she walked over with light footsteps and sat down across him. "Do you have anything you wish to say?" she asked gently. Derek instinctively lifted his head and looked over, only to suddenly discover that her pupils had somehow turned into golden vertical slits. His mind went adrift as he seemed to enter a sleepwalking state. Aflor adjusted the candle flame, letting the dim yellow light completely shine on the boy's face. Her pale golden pupils became increasingly indifferent, just like an emotionless audience. Suddenly, rings after rings of faint light appeared in those pale golden vertical pupils. It seemed to form a vortex and constructed a maze. In his stupor, Derek felt himself drifting away into the endless darkness and countless bright colors. At that moment, he suddenly became clear-headed. He felt as if something had ingeniously caught him in that state of reverie. He saw the flickering yellow candlelight and Aflor sitting across him with her pale gold vertical pupils. In a corner's shadow, a grizzled chief, Elder Colin Iliad, walked out. After nodding to the chief, Aflor asked Derek, "What have you been doing all this time?" Derek remembered his training and maintained the same state of mind as before. "I don't know. I've always been in a daze as if I was in a dream. Only occasionally will I have clearness of mind." At the same time as his reply, 2 complex dark green symbols appeared in Demon Hunter Colin's eyes. Aflor continued, "Do you know that you had a conflict with Dark Regents?" "I only remember that we were fighting. I felt like I had seen a man hanging upside down on a cross and a man in a pointed hat and a crystal monocle. Yes, I saw him back at the dungeon." He had opened his mouth and spoke with a smile. Derek told a long story. Aflor looked at the chief and pressed, "What did he say?" "I can't remember. I can only remember one thing." He said with a smile, "Fallen creator, true creator." Shepherd, Derek almost failed to control his excitement. He had taken such a risk just to tell the chief the name of the fallen creator and that a shepherd was suspicious. The fallen creator. The true creator. It matches with the content on the murals at the bottom of the temple. Colin nodded slightly and whispered with a frown, "Shepherd, and then?" Aflor's voice remained abnormally gentle. Derek answered in his stupor, "After that, they clashed, and there was a lot of light, very bright lights. Then, I woke up and kept coughing." The dark green symbols in Colin's eyes didn't fade this entire time as he motioned for Evelyn to ask about the details. Derek answered selectively, and he had pushed the blame onto Amon according to his script. He claimed amnesia on anything that went beyond that. Finally, Aflor asked, where did you get the axe? Where did you get the Sun Pathways potion formula? I bought the axe from an underground market. That person was masked, and I could only tell that he was male. The Sun Pathway potion formula was left to me by my parents. They had discovered it during an expedition, Derek answered confidently. These were points of suspicion that had always been there, so the hanged man had assumed they were bound to ask them while he was questioned. Therefore, he had made Derek to repeatedly rehearse the answers. Although the City of Silver's underground market was semi-open, there were still people who tried to conceal their identities for a variety of reasons. This provided the best explanation for Derek. After Aflor finished seriously listening to him, she turned her head sideways to Demon Hunter Colin and said, "He's not lying. There's no way he can lie. I'm using the powers of Glory Crown." Colin nodded his head and said, "In this state, he doesn't show any traces of evil, degeneration, or corruption." Discovering these traits was a special ability of a demon hunter. As a high-sequence job, demon hunters were the best at concealing their movements and intentions, making it impossible for them to be detected by targets who could foretell danger. Therefore, every demon hunter was a devil's nemesis. After some thought, Colin got up and left the room. He said to the shadow in the corner outside, "I'll release Derek later. I think he's fine for the time being. However, secretly monitor him for a while. If Amon is able to produce 2 avatars, he might be able to create a 3rd. "Yes, Chief," the shadow responded respectfully. After Derek woke up, the interrogation chamber was empty, with only words informing him that he was free to leave. He secretly heaved a sigh of relief as he began walking out. While doing so, he thought of Mr. Hanged Man's advice: "You can't relax just like that and end up careless. The secret surveillance will definitely continue for some time, otherwise, your chief is lacking." Yes, I can't even recite the honorific name of Mr. Fool anymore for the time being. Derek muttered to himself as he walked down the spiral staircase. As he was walking, he suddenly saw a familiar figure dressed in a purple-striped black robe. It was the beautiful shepherd elder Lovia. Her pale gray eyes swept over Derek, and a gentle smile appeared on her face. Back in her room, with an indifferent expression, Lovia walked to the desk and unfolded a piece of parchment that was made from leather. Her left hand pinched the index finger of her right hand and snapped the tip of her finger. However, not a single drop of blood dripped. It was as if her blood had been gathered onto the surface of her finger. With this finger, she drew a complex symbol on the piece of paper. It was made up of a pupil-less eye which represented secrecy, and the contorted lines which represented change. After careful examination, she wrapped the finger with this piece of paper, stuffed it into her mouth, and bit on it noisily before swallowing it all. With only 4 fingers left, flesh and blood suddenly squirmed around the wound on her right palm. It quickly grew into a new index finger, one that looked slightly pale. She lowered her head, looked at her palm, and whispered a phrase, "The fool?" Chapter 401, Divine Epiphany. Backlund, in a basement that resembled a temple. Mr. A, dressed in a hooded black robe, motionlessly quietly knelt in front of a figurine of the hanged giant for an extended period of time. Suddenly, he pricked up his ears as if he was listening to something. After a short pause, Mr. A's hands jerked up, and he snapped his right index finger with his left palm. He stuffed the bloody finger into his mouth and munched on it like he was eating snacks, making crunching sounds. Gulp. Mr. A's throat wiggled, and he swallowed his gnawed fingers into his stomach. His body suddenly trembled, as if he was being grabbed and shaken by an invisible figure. In this state, Mr. A stretched out his right hand and used the blood from his wound to write words on the ground. Those words were written in neither Jotun or Dragonese, which could stir the powers of nature, nor was it in Hermes, which was used for sacrificial rituals. Instead, they were written in the most ordinary and commonplace language, Loan. The scarlet color quickly gathered together and the words pieced together into a few sentences. Found, the fool that doesn't belong to this era. The mysterious ruler above the gray fog. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck. Adorers and devotees in Backlund. After the end of the divine epiphany, Mr. A stopped trembling, and a new finger grew out of his squirming wound. He lowered his head and carefully read the words he had just written, the corners of his mouth curled up in the shadows. By your divine revelation. Mr. A humbly prostrated as though he had found the meaning of his existence once again. City of Silver, at the top of the spire. Lovia walked to the window and looked down at the candlelight in the darkness, her expression softening. After an unknown period of time, she heard a knock at the door. Your Excellency. Lovia turned around with alacrity and greeted the visitor with a smile. The door opened backward automatically. The person standing outside was none other than demon hunter Colin Iliad. He was draped with a brown coat and a leather belt with secret compartments around his waist. Lovia, the abnormality of the exploratory team has been verified, Colin described plainly. As captain, regardless of your condition, you have to stay in the dungeon for 3 days and undergo the Glory Crown's cleansing. You should know that this is the rule. Lovia didn't show the slightest hint of anger as she calmly smiled. I know, I've already made preparations to stay in the dungeon for a long time. When it's over, I can accept any arrangements even if you guys still don't trust me. As she spoke, she had walked to the door and went past Demon Hunter Colin while facing him. Colin turned silently and followed her down the winding steps. Halfway there, they heard heart-wrenching cries and shouts. Is it starting again? Lovia asked with a slightly confused expression. Colin nodded and replied in a low voice, yes, this is a destiny that we can't escape from, at this moment, in a large hall in the middle levels of the spire. The members of the exploratory team and the few residents of the City of Silver who had been corrupted were pressed down to the ground by seemingly corporeal holy lusters. They were unable to move, as though they were carrying a huge mountain on their backs. A couple in their 40s with dark skin held a sword with complicated patterns as they walked up to a young man in his early 20s. The young man's body had already turned into a meat slush, but his head was still intact. Only a long, thin, blood-red tendril grew out of it. Seeing the couple approaching, he shouted in horror, Dad, Mom, what are you doing? Didn't we agree to eat grilled iron scorpions together tonight? Dad, Mom, I caught a lot of iron scorpions for you. The couple couldn't bear it any longer and turned their heads to the side, but they raised the sword in their hands high into the air. After 2 stabbing sounds rang out, the young man stopped his wailing. He twitched first, then he completely lost all signs of life. Elsewhere, a young girl, who was around 10 years old, raised a sword with complicated patterns on it. Tears were streaming down her face as she stabbed her elder sister. The girl lying on the ground suddenly laughed and gently said, From today onwards, you'll have to live your own life. Don't be naive anymore. The girl immediately cried until her vision turned into a blur, and the sword in her hand stopped in midair. However, a strong palm pressed the back of her hand, pushing it forward. Oof! The girl was left stunned, as though she couldn't hear or see anything. This was the ancient curse that everyone in the City of Silver was under. They had to kill their own blood relatives to prevent them from turning into terrifying and strange evil spirits after their deaths. Therefore, even though Dark had completely mutated into a monster and was corrupted by an unknown existence, having no value in interrogating, the Shadow Observer didn't dare to kill him on the spot. Instead, he tried his best to restrain the monster and bring it back to the spire to wait for his parents. Otherwise, the situation would only become worse. The exploratory team members were currently receiving the same treatment that they had been subjected to, a process that remained unchanging for more than 2,000 years. Although no one knew if they would mutate after dying in this state, no one dared to gamble on it. Fortunately, the City of Silver didn't have a large population, and all of them lived in the same area. Under the arrangements of the upper echelons for each generation, there were quite a few people who were related to each other by blood. Even if they were limited by 3 generations, they would still be able to find quite a few. Because of this, the Beyonder in charge of setting up a patrol team would first have to consider the matter of blood ties in order to prevent any unexpected situations from occurring. The requirements for exploratory teams weren't that strict because their missions were always to invade deep into the darkness and stay far away from the City of Silver. Even if they died or mutated, it wouldn't affect everyone's safety. Once a resident no longer had blood relatives within 3 generations, they would be placed under strict surveillance, and as soon as he became seriously ill or visibly aged, he would be exiled into the depths of darkness, away from the City of Silver. When the previous captain of the exploratory team, Udal, was isolated in the dungeon, there were actually 3 elders in the spire. However, the one who took action was Chief Colin Iliad in the end. Otherwise, they could only attempt a seal. This was because Udal was the elder brother of his direct kin. Shepherd Lovia and Demon Hunter Colin silently entered the bottom level of the spire. Accompanied by a few Dawn Paladins, they arrived at the depths of the dungeon. Soon, both of them stopped outside a cell. The Dawn Paladins dispersed themselves a distance away. Without any abnormalities, she walked into a room with a single bed, a table, and a single candle at a moderate pace. Before the metal door closed, she turned around and looked at Demon Hunter Colin with her pale grey eyes. "Your Excellency, you once told me that when residents of the City of Silver leave this place and die in the depths of the darkness, they won't immediately turn into evil spirits. A few days have to pass. Therefore, the other members of the exploratory team have plenty of time to pull open a distance from them." Colin nodded and expressed his agreement. Lovia closed her eyes, revealing a sad smile. "In an exploration 2 months ago, a team member died in front of me. I pretended to be separated from the rest of the team. I waited there for 5 days, but he didn't turn into an evil spirit." Demon Hunter Colin looked at her in silence, not saying anything until the metal door closed with a clang, and the seal took shape. In the ancient palace above the fog. After waiting for a while, Klein was finally relieved when he saw that there were no changes to the crimson star which symbolized Little Sunday. He should have succeeded. He rubbed his temples, wrapped his spirituality around his body, and descended back to the real world. As soon as he felt the presence of his body, Klein experienced the bitter cold. He sneezed, then he quickly removed the wall of spirituality and crawled back into bed. Sadly, his bed was already ice cold. "Fortunately, my body receives a certain degree of protection after entering the grey fog, otherwise, would probably catch a cold tomorrow." Klein wrapped himself tightly with his blanket and sighed. The current state he was in reminded him of a joke he had heard in his previous life. Warmth is basically gained by vibration. Before his bed warmed up again, he could only let his mind wander as he thought about all sorts of matters. "Yes, there are no pressing matters for me recently. The magician's rules have been concluded. Even if I don't challenge the impossible and only engage in acting normally, I should be able to digest the potions around New Year's. My next task is to collect the Beyonder ingredients for the Faceless Potion and save up the necessary funds. But that's not something I can rush." The taut strings in Klein's mind gradually softened, and he suddenly had the thought of resting for 2 to 3 days. As the bed warmed, he fell asleep without realizing it. When he woke up, he heard the church bells ringing 8 times. Klein stretched out his arm, felt the cold, and silently withdrew it. "It seems to have turned colder again today. Since there's nothing pertinent to do, it seems I can just continue sleeping in." Relaxed, he closed his eyes again. But after a while, he heard his stomach growling and felt the bulge in his lower abdomen. "Life is full of hard choices," Klein mumbled. After 10 minutes or so of struggling between the two feelings, he finally gave up, got up, and rushed to the bathroom next door. After changing his clothes and washing up, he went down to the first floor and took out some ingredients to cook Seafarer noodles. This time, he didn't intend to use the meat sauce that he bought, but instead, he wanted to try the meat paste he had made 2 days ago. This was the meat paste he had carefully chosen from the ingredients based on his memories. Although there were ultimately differences in the ingredients between the two worlds, preventing him from fully replicating the authentic taste, Klein still found it pretty good after sampling it. It wasn't long before he had a bowl of Seafarer noodles with condiments and meat paste. He found it a really wonderful morning. Keeping in with the tradition of this world, he browsed through the newspapers as he ate, and he checked if Eye of Wisdom had placed an advertisement first. Based on his late-night thoughts from yesterday, Klein decided to have some fun today, so he considered whether he should go to a concert, an opera, or a play. The tickets to many of the music halls in the West Borough, Hillston Borough, and Sherwood Borough are at least 6 solely, and if it's a famous musician, then they would even be on the order of pounds. Music halls specially catered to common folk range from 6 to 9 pence. Those that are open to the poor with money to spare in East Borough only need 1 pence. Klein flipped through the relevant materials to select his choice of entertainment for the day. At that moment, he heard the doorbell ring. Ding dong. Chapter 402, Digging. Who is it? Klein jerked his head up to look at the door. He felt as if he were suffering from an illness. The fear of hearing the doorbell ring was identical to the symptoms he had experienced on Earth, being afraid of his cell phone's ringing. Putting down the newspaper and magazine, he looked at the empty plate which had been cleaned even of its seasonings, then he stood up, and he walked to the door. Before he got a hold of the handle, he already knew that it was Dr. Aaron outside. "Don't you need to work?" Klein mumbled as he opened the door. "Good morning, Aaron. The fog is gray today." He smiled. Aaron was still wearing his cold expression, but there was an additional sense of anxiety and fear written on his face. He nudged his gold-rimmed spectacles and, without bothering to greet him, bluntly said, "Sherlock, I had another dream. I dreamed of Wuxia again." Klein almost froze. "That's not right. The real paper crane is with me, above the gray fog, while the one I folded is with the nighthawks. You're still able to dream of Wuxia with a paper crane which was poorly folded by a nighthawk? That's not scientific, no, that's not mystic." Klein became serious and asked, "The same dream?" "No, it's not that scary this time." Aaron became a little calmer. "I dreamed about the grim cemetery. You know of it, right?" "Yes," Klein answered simply. Back then, he had caught a group of students and a mysticism enthusiast who was a complete beginner, Kapusky, engaging in a spiritual dance outside Grim Cemetery. He later received another copper whistle from the latter which could be used to summon a messenger. Aaron drew a deep breath of cold air and continued, "I dreamed of the woods outside Grim Cemetery. I dreamed of a birch tree which had a layer of bark peeled off its trunk. Wuxia was sitting underneath that tree, looking at me quietly." "And then?" Klein pressed. Aaron shook his head. "The dream ended there." "What a strange matter. Has Dr. Aaron's dream got nothing to do with the paper crane?" "No, if it wasn't related, then there wouldn't have been a situation where the dream changed after the paper crane was switched. Furthermore, I also performed a divination using the paper crane above the gray fog and obtained the corresponding revelations." Klein said in a measured voice, "This is no longer within my scope of understanding. What do you want from me, Aaron?" Aaron breathed out warm air that dispersed into white mist. "I want to pay a visit to the area outside Grim Cemetery. I want to do it now, while it's still daytime. Can you protect me? I'll pay you £1. Heading over to the place that appeared in the dream now. He probably wouldn't encounter anything too strange during the day." Klein thought for a moment and said, "I can accept this request, but I suggest that you go back to the same cathedral and tell your dream to the bishop you're familiar with." Aaron agreed, then said doubtfully, "Why do you always suggest that I go to the cathedral? I know, you've explained it before, in a very logical way, that if mystical powers exist in this world, then the churches, which have been leading humanity, must be the ones with the strongest mystical powers, and if there are none, then at least we can go to the church to get psychological comfort and corresponding connections. However, why do you suggest that I go to the cathedral for something that isn't considered too strange?" Klein considered for 2 seconds, then replied seriously, "I'm a detective. I've come into contact with a lot of unusual things, so I understand the special nature of the church. I also know when to ask for help." "Really?" Aaron listened with a serious expression. The corners of Klein's mouth curled up. "Just kidding. Take it easy, Aaron. I'm going to change my clothes first. And also do the dishes." Having chatted with Aaron at the door for a long time without his thick coat, he turned rather stiff from the cold winds. Taking this opportunity, Klein went to the washroom, went above the grey fog, and divined the degree of danger for this mission. He received the answer that there was almost no risk. If he received a revelation indicating that it was dangerous, his plan was to reject the mission using the Church of the Evernight Goddess as an excuse. Hillston Borough, Myriad Star Cathedral. "Sherlock, why don't you hire a maid? As a great detective, you can afford to have several servants," Aaron asked, as he led Klein to the Church of the Evernight Goddess's largest cathedral in Hillston Borough. This was something that he had wanted to ask while in the carriage, but he had never found the opportunity to change the subject. Klein sighed, and said heavily, "Aaron, let me tell you a story. There was a detective who hired 2 maids, a cook, and an assistant, and he was doing pretty well, but one day he took over a case and successfully homed in on the murderer, who was a very savage and cruel man. He sneaked into the detective's house with the intention of revenge. The detective was a fighting expert, and in the end, he was only slightly injured, but 2 of his servants died because of him. Do you get it, Aaron?" "I see." Aaron's voice had a hint of empathy. "Sherlock, I never knew that you've had such an experience." "No, the main character has nothing to do with me. I just made up a story. It's not like I can tell you directly that I'm involved in many strange and mystical matters, and that there will always be unspeakable secrets in my house, so that it's best I don't hire any servants." Klein looked forward and let out a long sigh. The cleaning of his home was done twice a week, mostly by Mrs. Stellan Sammer's maid. She was responsible for the most basic cleaning procedures, and each cleaning cost 1 solely. While they were talking, the 2 of them had already entered the hall of the Myriad Star Cathedral. It was dark, quiet, and devoid of candles, completely in line with the Church of the Evernight Goddess's style. At the very front of the hall was an altar engraved with a dark sacred emblem. The stars were inlaid with self-illuminating pearls, and the crimson moon was made of rubies. The rest of the hall was filled with the darkness of the night. With a single glance, he could see that the place was filled with specks of light as the crimson light illuminated the area, making the place extremely sacred. But Klein felt that this was inferior to the design used by St. Selena Cathedral in Tingen. That hall was pitch black, with only light penetrating from the front through the fist-sized holes. It resembled a star sky, making one feel awe from the bottom of one's heart. However, there's a problem with that kind of design. At night, the effect would be gone. Klein took a seat at random, took off his half-top hat and leaned on his black hardwood cane, while Aaron continued down the aisle to the confessional in search of the bishop. Sitting in such a large hall and looking at the people who were concentrating on praying, Klein's heart suddenly became tranquil. Come to think of it, this is only my 3rd time entering the goddess's cathedral. He let out a self-deprecating laugh. Inside the Cathedral of Serenity at Winter County. Leonard Mitchell put on his black windbreaker and red gloves and entered the room of the high-ranking deacon, Christette Sesamir. Congratulations, you have officially become a Red Glove. May the goddess bless you. Sesamir drew a crimson moon on his chest. He still had his mouth covered with his high collar. Praise the lady. The honor is mine. Leonard raised his right hand and gestured 4 points in a clockwise fashion. Casimir didn't say anything else and went straight to the point. According to your request, I've placed you in Soist's team. He's a soul assurer and possesses a mystical item. I've already ordered someone to prepare a beyonder weapon for you that you'll need. Your team will be in charge of a devil summoning case, and you'll take into consideration certain clues to perform the search. For example, cases that have happened consecutively in Backlund and matters related to a tarot ritual. Yes, Reverend Casimir. Leonard held no objections towards the mission. This will be the beginning of my revenge, he silently said to himself. Westborough, in the periphery of Grim Cemetery. Klein accompanied Dr. Aaron as they took quite a while to walk around the nearby woods, coughing from time to time as a result of the falling grayish-white dust. Maybe there isn't a tree like that. Dreams can't fully reflect reality. Towards the end of the search, even Aaron was feeling a little uncertain himself. Fortunately, I'm good at finding things. Klein pointed with his cane and said, let's take a look over there and make it our final effort. All right. Aaron gasped for a breath of air. After a short walk, Aaron suddenly stopped and said, while pointing diagonally ahead, over there, over there. About a dozen meters away, a birch tree with a strip of bark around its trunk stripped off stood there quietly, as if it were waiting for them. It's identical to the one in my dream, Aaron said with conviction. Klein smiled and said with some vigilance, but there's no Wuxia. Aaron got close to the birch tree, frowned for a while, then he suddenly pointed to the side of the tree and said, back then, Wuxia was sitting here, and he was pointing at the mud below him with his finger. Pointing at the mud below him? Klein stood at the side, looking down at the almost unwithered grass. You want to dig it up? Aaron nodded. We've already found this place, so we should confirm what's here. Sherlock, go to the cemetery and borrow 2 shovels. It's better if I stay here. You go to the cemetery, I'm worried something might happen to you, Klein said cautiously. All right. Aaron didn't refuse, and he immediately left the forest. After a while, after offering some money, he returned with 3 shovels and a tomb keeper, and they began to dig. While Klein was digging, he suddenly smelled something familiar. As the soil on the surface parted, the things below were gradually exposed. It was the body of a child that was already greatly rotten. His skin and flesh looked as if they were about to melt, and many bugs crawled in and out of his nose and mouth. Clang! The shovel fell from Aaron's hand and hit a rock. He pointed to the legs of the corpse, his mouth moving frantically, but he was unable to say a word. Klein endured the nausea and looked closely, discovering that the child's left leg was obviously missing its lower half. At the same time, Aaron took 2 steps back and fell to the ground, shouting sharply, Wuxia. Wuxia. It was Wuxia's corpse. Chapter 403, The Fate of a Private Detective. He's dead? Wuxia is dead? And he seems to have been dead for some time. Could this be fake? Klein looked at the body of the child in surprise and suspicion as many thoughts bubbled in his mind. From what he knew, Wuxia was a special child who could be involved with a sequence one of the monster pathway, Snake of Mercury, in some way. In the divination game he played, a casual, "Doctor, your luck will get worse," was enough to make Aaron suffer from bad luck for an extended period of time. The paper crane he folded allowed Aaron's astral projection to be located in the spirit world and be instilled with artificial revelations. Even above the gray fog, Klein only received an inkling of his location and couldn't come to an effective conclusion. How could such a child die for no reason? He was dead before Dr. Aaron's dreams? What about his family? Klein narrowed his eyes, and despite his intense nausea, he carefully examined the highly rotten body. He noticed some torn tarot cards in the surrounding soil. His spiritual intuition told him that the corpse in front of him was most likely Will. It's really shocking and difficult to understand. I should go above the grey fog later and confirm if it's a fake death from Will. Wait, what does this have to do with me? I had already decided not to get involved in this matter any further, in case I get entangled by some snake of mercury. This might be even more terrifying than sealed artifact 0-08. Klein snapped out of his daze and said to the terrified tomb keeper and Dr. Aaron, who was on the verge of a mental breakdown. Call the police. Okay. Okay. The tomb keeper was taken aback at first before he repeated his reply. With the shovel in hand, he turned and ran out of the woods, at a speed that was so fast that it appeared as though he was being chased by a zombie. As expected, he's just an ordinary person and isn't cautious at all. In this kind of situation, shouldn't he be wary of the people around him who might have malicious intent? By exposing your back, it would be easy for you to be hit by a shovel. Klein glanced at the back of the tomb keeper and shook his head with a sigh. When he was a Nighthawk in Tingen, he had read a lot of case files and found out that many of the victims had ended up becoming victims of their companions. Thinking of this, Klein walked to Dr. Aaron, bent down, and stretched out his hand. There's nothing to be afraid of. He's already dead. It's the death that scares me. Aaron calmed down a bit, and without accepting Klein's help, he got up by himself. His black frock coat was covered with dirt, and Klein felt his heart pain for the clothes for some baffling reason. I'm the kind of person who can't stand seeing anything valuable get damaged. He inwardly sighed with emotion. Noticing that Aaron was still panicking, Klein laughed and said, at such times, praying to the deity you believe in has quite a remarkable effect. Is that so? Aaron was stunned. He tapped his chest 4 times in a clockwise manner and chanted softly, the Evernight Goddess is nobler than the stars and more eternal than eternity. Your devout believer prays for your blessing. After repeating this over and over again, he gradually calmed down, no longer feeling as terrified as before. Klein drew a triangular sacred emblem on his chest and silently whispered to himself, God of steam and machinery, your completely unfaithful believer is begging for your blessings. As he spoke, he couldn't help but laugh at himself, suspecting that he might be smote to death by lightning on the spot. However, lightning and thunder belong to the Lord of Storms, and it isn't in the domain of the God of steam and machinery. Klein thought in a relaxed manner. After about 20 minutes, the two of them found themselves sitting in an interrogation room at a nearby police station. During the testimony, Klein frankly informed the police that he was a private investigator who wasn't too sure of what was happening. As for Dr. Aaron, he described his dream in detail as the reason for digging to find the body. Klein could tell that the police didn't believe him at all, but after they had gone out for a while, they immediately changed their attitudes, saying that there was nothing suspicious about Dr. Aaron and Detective Moriarty. All they had to do was sign their statements and leave. Aaron was surprised, but Klein wasn't surprised. It was obvious that the Nighthawks had been involved. The advantage of having the doctor head to the Myriad Star Cathedral in advance was demonstrated. Before leaving the police station, Klein wasn't surprised to see a familiar figure. It was the Nighthawk who had entered his dream earlier. The man on duty, who was probably a captain, was still wearing a grey windbreaker and was obviously more resistant to the cold than Klein. His blue eyes swept past Klein's face without any signs of abnormality, pretending to be an ordinary senior inspector. Klein, who was also pretending to be an ordinary private detective, nudged his glasses, put on half-top hat, and left the station with Dr. Aaron in a carriage. After instructing his carriage driver to head to Minsk Street first, Aaron turned to Klein and said, Sherlock, do you think this will be the end of it? If that body really belongs to Will, then you shouldn't be troubled any longer. Klein paused and continued, Aaron, have you found anything else that's strange during this period of time? Regardless of what it is. Aaron thought about it and shook his head. No. This is worth celebrating. Klein sighed and said with a smile. To him, this was the best way things could end with Wuxia matter. Although the paper crane Klein had folded above the grey fog wouldn't reveal anything, and there would be no problems with any divination afterward, he was still a little worried that some nighthawk would suddenly think of something and use it to find some clues. And now, with the death of Wuxia, the case might soon reach a dead end, put in the archives, and temporarily declared a closed case. No one would pay any more attention to it without any new developments. Aaron relaxed and asked suspiciously, frankly, I don't think my statement was very convincing. Why did the cops choose to believe it in the end? I don't know either, Klein feigned puzzlement and said, I thought I'd have to get my lawyer to take me home again, no, bail me out. Aaron smirked and said, Sherlock, you seem to have a lot of experience in being sent to the police station? Klein laughed and replied in a deep voice, it's the fate of every private detective. Just as Klein and Aaron were being taken to the police station near Grim Cemetery, Furs Wall was wearing a long black dress and a black bonnet with a fine mesh hanging down. She entered the silent cemetery and found the grave of Mrs. Alisa. She and Zio had gone to Empress Burrow an hour ago to visit Viscount Glaint, and they had successfully gotten a verbal agreement for borrowing £400 without any interest. Viscount Glaint's only request was that the two Beyonders accompany him to the gathering Mr. A would convene tonight to ensure his safety. He was anxious to procure a royal jellyfish's venom crystal so that he could complete the concoction of the apothecary potion. Audrey had found the horn of an adult flying unicorn in the family treasury, and she had taken one out in the name of doing a biological experiment, effectively offsetting part of her debt. She also put forward an additional condition for Viscount Glaint to get the help of Duke Negan's children to confirm if the dragon specimens in the treasury had a thousand-faced hunter and whether there were still light dots flashing inside. When the loan was settled, Furs was in no hurry to pray to Mr. Fool to close the deal as quickly as possible, because it would make Zio intuitively turn suspicious if things developed too quickly. Taking advantage of her free time, she changed her clothes and rented a horse carriage to get to Grim Cemetery, which was located on the outskirts of Westboro. Knowing the law of Beyonder characteristics conservation and indestructibility, Furs realized that the main ingredient that turned her into an apprentice was the Beyonder characteristic left behind by Mrs. Alisa. In a way, she had inherited her powers. Therefore, she couldn't help but pay a visit and put a bouquet of flowers in front of Mrs. Alisa's grave and thank her. It was early winter, and most of the flowers had long since withered, but Furs still bought a handful of plain flowers. These flowers were grown in a greenhouse and were quite expensive. Thank you, Emperor Roselle, for your invention. Furs said inwardly in a most sincere manner. As far as she knew, most of the flowers that the nobles used for their winter banquets came from greenhouses, while a tiny portion was delivered directly from the warm south by airships. This was more than the average middle-class worker could bear. Standing in front of the black tombstone, Furs took a deep look at the photograph of Mrs. Alisa before bending down to lay down the flowers and whispered, "Thank you." She immediately straightened up, closed her eyes, and quietly recalled the past. At this moment, she heard a slightly aged voice. "You really are a good and kind-hearted lady." Furs opened her eyes and turned her head, realizing that Mr. Lawrence, from the Abraham family, had also appeared there at some point. He was also holding a bouquet of plain but elegant flowers in his hand. "No, this is not goodness, nor is it kindness. Mrs. Alisa once gave me, a person who had lost her mother, an unforgettable period of warmth," Furs said sincerely. Her eyes were suddenly moist. Lawrence, who only had wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, put down the flowers and sighed. "This shows that you value relationships." After chatting for a while, when Furs was about to leave, Lawrence, who was waving her goodbye, suddenly began to cough violently. Cough. 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 He coughed until his legs buckled and fell to the ground. It seemed as if he would die at any moment from suffocation. As a doctor who had graduated from an accredited school, Furs didn't hesitate to turn around, crouch down, and begin performing first aid. After a while, Lawrence's condition finally stabilized. He wiped the saliva from the corner of his mouth and smiled at Furs. "Lady, can you take me back to the hotel?" "No problem." Furs helped him to his feet. Lawrence looked ahead, his eyes a little out of focus. He coughed lightly, and he said with a sad and self-deprecating laugh, "My life might be coming to an end." Chapter 404, Entrust Westboro, Carlpensa Hotel. Furs helped Lawrence into his room and laid him down on the bed. It was a rather luxurious hotel, with thick, soft, grayish-yellow carpets everywhere except the washroom. On the walls hung imitations of famous oil paintings. Lawrence gasped for air and said, "Thank you, Miss Wall, and please forgive a dying man for not being able to bow." "No, Mr. Lawrence, your problem has eased. As a former medical doctor, I can tell you without a doubt that you can still live. After some rest, we'll go to a clinic or a hospital," Furs consoled him. Lawrence smiled. "I know my physical condition very well. You don't have to comfort me. Besides, I'm an amateur astrologer. I already had a premonition that I'm going to die in this hotel in Backlund." Aside from some superficial concealment, everything he said was the truth. He was already close to 80, and he was no longer that robust and spirited young man from before. If not for the sequence potions that elevated his constitution, he might have already been buried in some random cemetery. Originally, Lawrence thought he could live for another 10 years, but who would have thought that he would encounter a rebellion caused by the former traveler Bodis? He suffered relatively serious injuries at the hands of the Aurora Order, and his remaining descendants all died in that disaster. This dealt him a great blow, and he almost didn't manage to recover from it. The search for his brothers and their descendants in Backlund had only resulted in him receiving news of their deaths, dealing him a significant blow to his mental well-being once more. Compounded by all these things, Lawrence clearly felt that his life had come to an end. His initial plan was to return to the graves of Labero and Elisa again and present a bouquet of flowers. He would then return immediately and meet with the other members of the Elder Council to set things in order before his death, but being an elderly man, his condition was beyond his control. Without waiting for a response from Furs, Lawrence struggled to retrieve a palm-sized notebook from the inside pocket of his half-open coat. The hard paper cover of the notebook was bronze green, giving off a very ancient feeling. On its surface, the words, "I came, I saw, I record," was written in ancient Fasak. Lawrence placed the notebook on the quilt in front of his chest and took a deep breath. "Mississippi Wall, if I die here, can you help me send it to Pritz Harbor?" "Mr. Lawrence, you'll be fine," Furs emphasized. At the same time, she subconsciously glanced at the notebook and found that it wasn't thick at all. There were a total of 3 types of papers inside, one of which was a yellow type of parchment which had very few pages. The other was yellowish-brown goatskin and the number of pages was in the middle of the range. The last was comprised of ordinary white paper and was the most common. Lawrence laughingly said with great difficulty, "I mean, Mississippi Wall, will you help? Pritz Harbor isn't far. It's not even a trip. If it needs to be rushed, then I can even make the round trip in half a day by taking the steam locomotive." Furs nodded. Lawrence breathed a sigh of relief as his mind seemed to recover a little. "After I die, wait 10 minutes. Retrieve the glowing object from my body, and then send it along with this notebook to Dorian Gray at the Pritz Harbor's Fishermen Association. The £42 in cash in my wallet will be the reward and my gratitude. As for these clothes of mine, let it turn to ash along with me." "No, you don't need to give me anything." "No, you'll be fine, Mr. Lawrence," Furs said earnestly. As if he hadn't heard her, Lawrence whispered to himself, "Maybe Dorian will give you additional rewards, but it depends on you." "I believe you. From Elisa's matter, I can tell that you're a good girl," he suddenly seemed to turn lucid as he said to Furs, "Ms. Wall, can you go down to the first floor and bring me a jug of water? I don't know when the waiter will come over." "No problem." Without thinking, Furs took a water jug and walked out of the room. After walking a few steps, she suddenly felt that something was amiss. The water jug in her hand was heavy, and there was obviously a lot of water in it. Just as she was about to turn around and ask, she suddenly sensed a strong fluctuation of spirituality in the room. That was. For a moment Furs froze, and then she understood what Mr. Lawrence was trying to do. As death approached, he could clearly sense that something was wrong with his body. He was afraid of losing control and turning into a monster. He wanted to die as a human, not a monster, so he chose to end his own life. That was the last form of decency for a Beyonder. Of course, if he had turned into a monster, all his plans would have come to naught. With this in mind, Furs became dejected. She waited outside for nearly 10 minutes before she pushed open the door and entered. She saw Lawrence lying silently on the bed, looking like he had aged considerably. Beside him was a diamond the size of an eye. The light which shone in through the window was constantly refracted by the diamond, forming a scene as beautiful as the radiance of the stars. Furs sighed and performed a careful examination. She found that the cause of Lawrence's death was the most ordinary form of cardiac arrest. Cherwood Borough. 15 Minsk Street. Klein rested for a while after getting home. He then went above the grey fog, having plans to divine the situation with Wuxia. He had the paper crane fly out of the trash pile in the corner and made it land on the long bronze table in front of him. Then, he took out the topaz pendant that was wrapped around his sleeve. As he held the spirit pendulum in his left hand, Klein used cogitation to adjust his condition before recalling the scenes he had seen in the woods outside the cemetery. He might not have noticed some of the details, but it was certain that his spirituality wouldn't miss any. This divination was mainly about using this point and relying on the grey fog to eliminate all distractions. After finishing his preparations, Klein took out a goatskin parchment and wrote the divination statement, "Wuxia is completely dead." Then, he pressed the paper crane next to the divination sentence, almost causing the topaz pendant to touch the words. After entering a state of cogitation and completing all the steps of the spirit dowsing, Klein opened his eyes and looked at the result. The topaz pendant was rotating counterclockwise at a fast frequency and high amplitude. It was a negative result. That meant that Wuxia wasn't completely dead. Klein was surprised, but it seemed to be within his expectations. He thought for a moment, then he changed the divination statement. That corpse was Wuxia's. This time, the spirit pendulum gave a positive result. The body did belong to Wuxia. An idea came to Klein's mind, and he wrote a new divination statement, "Wuxia's corpse will resurrect." After a few moments of calmly performing the divination, Klein saw the revelation. The pendulum was rotating counterclockwise with a fast frequency. That meant that Wuxia's corpse wouldn't be resurrected, or in other words, no reanimations. It looks like Wuxia had voluntarily or was forced to abandon his previous body, and he is surviving in another way. This matter has something to do with the Snake of Mercury? Klein tried to divine additional information, but he failed repeatedly, including the statement, Wuxia's present state. However, he repeated the divination using dream divination and inquired Wuxia's current location. He received a similar scene, a dark room with the sound of running water. However, the feeling it gave him seemed to be a little different. "Forget it, there's no need to waste any more time on this. I'm not planning to get involved anyway." Klein put away his spirit pendulum and prepared to return to the real world. Through the prior divination and everything that had happened before, he had a theory about Wuxia, but he couldn't confirm it. He suspected that Wuxia was another Snake of Mercury. As a sequence 1, a Snake of Mercury wasn't the only one. There could be up to 3 in existence at the same time. The Snake of Fate, who wielded destiny naturally, could locate Aaron's astral projection through the paper crane and show him a false revelation. Without a doubt, it also had the ability to change a person's fate. For some reason, Wuxia had become weak and was under the threat of the second snake of Mercury. Everything he did was to escape his counterpart. As for the reason for their conflict, the answer was simple. Without a sequence 0, there could be 3 sequence 1s at the same time, but once there was a sequence 0, there would be no sequence 1s. Regarding this sentence, the formula of the Dark Emperor potion clearly stated the truth. One of the main ingredients of the recipe was 2 Beyonder characteristics of a Prince of Disorder. Prince of Disorder was sequence 1 of the Dark Emperor pathway. As a sequence 1, if one wanted to advance to sequence 0, then one had to obtain all the Beyonder characteristics of the other 2 sequence 1s of the same pathway. With this guess in mind, Klein was increasingly afraid of getting involved with Wuxia's case. If my deduction is correct, it would be a genuine fight between deities, and I can't afford to get myself involved. Klein's spirituality descended, and he disappeared from the ancient palace above the grey fog. In Empress Burrow, in an inconspicuous house, the Beyonder gathering organized by Mr. A proceeded as scheduled. Furs and Zio had changed their clothes, and they accompanied Viscount Glaint, who was wearing an iron-black mask, into the hall. They randomly chose a seat and sat down. Viscount Glaint wrote down his needs to the attendants before the gathering officially began. He also prayed to the goddess that there would be a response later. As usual, Furs maintained her usual languidness and, in a rare instance, covered herself with a hood, concealing her face with the shadows. She was thinking about the situation with Mr. Lawrence. She knew very clearly what that diamond the size of an eye was. It was a Beyonder characteristic left behind by him. However, for the time being, she was unable to confirm what sequence it belonged to. Furs had casually flipped through the notebook, only to find that many of the pages were still blank. The written content was filled with all sorts of strange, odd, and mysterious symbols and magic labels, exceeding whatever she knew. What it is isn't important. What's important is that I keep my promise. Furs warned herself. At this moment, Mr. A, who was seated on a single sofa and was wearing an exaggerated hood, said hoarsely, "I have a mission. Help me find people who believe in the so-called fool." Furs instantly snapped back to her senses. Chapter 405, Cult, the Fool. The Beyonders who attended Mr. A's gathering either ruminated over the phrase or conversed with their companions to discuss whether they had ever met anyone who had a similar faith. When did such a cult appear? Someone asked in a low voice. At this point, Mr. A made the attendant beside him hold up a blackboard with a few lines of words written in the Lone language. The fool that doesn't belong to this era. The mysterious ruler above the grey fog. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck. As the attendees examined the blackboard, Mr. A said in a hoarse and jarring voice, "Do not use Hermes to read what's written here. Even more so for Jotun, Elvish, Dragonese, and ancient Hermes. You shouldn't even write the corresponding descriptions, otherwise, there is a high probability that something terrible will happen. Help me find believers in the fool." Of course, they might also be followers of the mysterious ruler above the grey fog or the king of yellow and black who wields good luck. As long as there's a clue, inform me immediately. The reward I'll provide will be so handsome that it will far exceed your imagination. This description. It sounds like an incredible existence. I've only seen similar descriptions in the ancient texts of the 7 gods, a gathering member exclaimed. His companion shook his head and said, "The beings which many cults believe in have similar descriptions." Is it really a cult? The other gathering members were stunned when they heard their discussion. Likely. Typically, when we summon a creature from the spirit world, we might have 3 lines describing it, but one of the lines would be about the blessed one of someone or that who belongs to. It wouldn't be in this format. A gathering member who was well versed in mysticism gave an explanation. As they vehemently conversed, Furs was nearly dumbfounded. Isn't that the honorific name of Mr. Fool? Even though it's described in the lone language, I'm sure of it. Why would Mr. A want to find the believers of Mr. Fool? Is the Aurora Order behind this? Furs's mind was in a mess. She knew that Mr. A was a member of the Aurora Order because of a particular terrorist organization had announced its responsibility in the assassination of Intis Ambassador Bakerland. After a brief moment of astonishment, Furs subconsciously began to examine herself, afraid that someone would discover that she was already a member of the Tarot Club and that, in some sense, she was an adorer of the Fool. I just recited the honorific name of the Fool according to the ancient Hermes on that piece of paper and was pulled above the grey fog. No one knows about this, and I don't have to be afraid of being investigated. But there's a link to that piece of paper with Mr. Fool's honorific name written on it. It was hidden in a book we borrowed from the Viscount Glaint. Thoughts rapidly flashed through Furs's mind. The Fool that doesn't belong to this era. Isn't that the description I saw on that piece of paper? I even dreamed of an evil spirit. At the same time, Zio remembered the incident that had frightened her, but her long experience as a bounty hunter had kept her from revealing anything unusual. And then, as she recalled, she thought about the origin of the piece of paper. It was hidden in the bookcase of History of the Lone Kingdom's Aristocracy. That book was borrowed from Viscount Glaint's study. Suddenly, a name flashed in both Furs's and Zio's minds at the same time, Viscount Glaint. At that moment, Viscount Glaint was looking at the blackboard and said to himself with interest, "This honorific name is very rare. But it sounds very impressive." Just as he finished his sentence, he looked to his side in puzzlement, asking Furs and Zio, "Why are you looking at me like that?" "Nothing." Zio and Furs rapidly shook their heads at the same time. After dinner, in an elegantly decorated house, Audrey brought the huge golden retriever, Susie, into the living room under the guidance of her psychology teacher, Escalante. She was attending the academic meeting that had been agreed upon last week. Her maid and bodyguard stayed behind while she walked with Susie into a spacious activity room. In the activity room, be it for the atmosphere or some other reason, the gas lamps were not lit. The room was lit by gold-plated candle lamps on the coffee table and cupboard. Before Audrey could take a good look at her surroundings, she saw a gentleman in his 30s walking towards her. He wore a grey tailcoat. "This is the owner of this place, Mr. Stephen Hamprez, a furniture merchant," the long-haired Escalante introduced him. She was just about to tell him Audrey's identity when Hamprez chuckled and said, "Escalante, don't say anything. Let me have a chance at guessing." He had a neatly trimmed mustache and charming dark brown eyes. He appeared very gentle and elegant, nothing like a furniture merchant but more like a university lecturer. After seriously sizing up Audrey a few times, he smiled and said, "Escalante only mentioned that you were her student. Heh, I believe you're a cultured noble lady, and you aren't someone who only looks good. There's no need for you to worry about a decline in the quality of your life. You're a little excited, very curious, and a relatively simple but also full of love. Of course, the most obvious point is that you're very beautiful, just like an angel." He made a final joke, pressed his hand to his chest, bowed, and said, "Welcome, the beautiful Miss Angel. You're right, as expected of a member of the Psychology Alchemists. However, what you managed to observe was the me from a few months ago. It's all a facade I've put on for myself." Audrey opened her mouth in surprise and astonishment. "Did you know me before, Mr. Hamprez?" She didn't let her shocked expression linger too long on her face, because such emotions were meant to be instantaneous and wouldn't last too long. If anyone were to be surprised for several seconds, then it meant that their performance was most likely an act. Audrey didn't notice this at first, but after watching others act all this time, she naturally came up with a lot of rules. No, I still don't know you. This is just the basics of being a psychology enthusiast. Helpless chuckled. Before he could finish his sentence, Audrey had already completed her observations and made a corresponding judgment based on her surroundings. His attire and the furnishings of his house all indicate that he's a person who cares deeply about how people view him. The sapphire on the ring of his left hand doesn't look small, but its actual quality is very ordinary. There are no symbols or magic labels on it. His finances aren't as good as he presents them to be. He's vain. Even though he was very enthusiastic just now, the way he stands there, the direction in which his feet point, and the changes in his emotional colors all indicate that he still has many concerns and is on his guard. He sincerely commended me on my looks, but it wasn't in the way a man would look at a woman. There are signs of him using facial products, and his eyebrows are definitely drawn. His skills are inferior to my makeup maidservant, Solia, but they're better than mine. The cologne he uses is confusion, something that I've only seen women use before. Yes, he probably likes men, and the role he plays is the weaker one in the relationship. At the same time, Audrey expressed her longing skillfully. I'd love to have your observational powers, Mr. Helpless. As she spoke, she maintained a faint smile while being introduced to the other 7 or 8 people in the activity room under Helpless's and Escalante's lead. The lovers of both mysticism and psychology were either descendants of fallen aristocrats, associate professors at universities, or the children of the rich. For example, the father of a young man was the owner of Philip's department store, the most famous department store in Backlund. In the exchange that followed, Audrey basically only listened. The only time she spoke was by asking questions, fully expressing her curiosity and yearning. In this academic discussion, Escalante and Helpless deliberately mentioned the body of heart and mind, as well as the spirit world and the collective subconscious. They also shared some relatively unique points of view, allowing Audrey to gradually understand some of the questions she had accumulated all this time. When the discussion ended and they were out of the house, Audrey glanced at Escalante beside her and asked, with a little naivety, "Ms. Escalante, when will I be as good in psychology as Mr. Helpless?" Escalante curled the corners of her lips and slightly tilted her head as she looked at her. Very soon. At night, Klein, who was about to get into bed, once again appeared above the gray fog. Despite being a little sleepy, he was jolted awake by the news Miss Magician had reported. The Aurora Order knows of the Fool? They know of my honorific name? The true creator has locked on to me? Klein abruptly sat up straight, as though he was about to face an attack. He quickly rejected the final theory. If the true creator had indeed locked onto him, Mr. A would have long visited him on the pretext of collecting a copper penny for the gas meter. Perhaps, even a saint might appear. That is to say, only the Fool and his corresponding honorific name are known, and the clues point to Backlund. Who leaked the news? Klein frowned as he carefully thought about it. Soon, he discovered a possibility. Little Sun has recently chanted my honorific name, and it happened when he was interacting with a member of the exploratory team who was corrupted by the true creator. He held a sacrificial ritual, and there were likely symbols corresponding to the Fool at the scene. The ancient palace above the gray fog appeared. So, the true creator sensed the existence of the Fool and confirmed that I was the one who had been sacrilegious, no, harassing, no that's not right either, spying on him. Also, Little Sun used the all-black eye at that time, which contains the mental corruption of the true creator. Through that, he has confirmed that my adorers and believers are in Backlund? I can't take the all-black eye out in the future. Having roughly understood the problem, Klein was left with another problem. Mr. A announced the bounty for Mr. Fool's believers at a not-so-private, relatively open Beyonder gathering. Is he just dumb, or is he deliberately fishing? Sigh, the Aurora Order members are all bigoted lunatics. Their brains are mostly damaged, so it's impossible to deduce their real intentions. This is as the saying goes, as long as I'm crazy, you won't be able to guess what I'm thinking. Chapter 406, A joyous but extremely helpless reality. Above the grey fog, the magnificent palace stood silently. Klein drummed his fingers rhythmically on the edge of the long bronze table, concentrating on what he could do in the face of the threat of the Aurora Order and Mr. A. While having a hard time figuring out the other party's intentions, he instinctively came up with an idea. Report Mr. A. Report illegal gatherings. Klein could very easily learn of the location where Mr. A held the gathering through Miss Magician, and thus, he would be able to easily report it to the Nighthawks, the mandated Punisher, or the Machinery Hive Mind in secret. An oracle of the Aurora Order was bound to garner enough attention. When that happens, Mr. A's safety would probably be at risk, so he probably wouldn't have the time or effort to track down the believers of the Fool. The problem, however, was that this was bound to implicate a group of innocent Beyonders, and Klein suspected that this was the reason why Mr. A directly offered a reward for the believers of the Fool. Perhaps he had long planned an escape. Once someone reports him, he would be able to confirm without a doubt that the Fool's believers were among the previous gathering members. As for who it was exactly, that wasn't important. Mr. A and the lunatics of the Aurora Order were definitely capable of taking exhaustive measures. And once these Beyonders fell into their hands, many of them would be unable to hide their secrets. The Aurora Order, or the Shepherd Pathway, which represented the true Creator, are the best at corrupting others. When the ideology of a Beyonder was completely twisted and once they believed in the true Creator wholeheartedly, what else could be kept a secret? It's not like there's no other way. It's best not to report it. Klein leaned back in his chair, collected his thoughts, and reorganized the entire matter. As he was thinking, he suddenly realized a problem. There were no believers or adorers of the Fool in this world. Even the Tarot Club only had a few members, and no one had divulged the relevant information. In other words, the Aurora Order wouldn't be able to find any relevant clues. There's nothing to worry about. The only bad outcome is that the Fool is now targeted by the true Creator. Although being targeted by an evil god isn't a pleasant feeling, it basically wouldn't affect anything else. Klein nodded thoughtfully. He had thought it through very clearly. The only flaw in this matter was that he had once used the title of the Fool, written in the language of ancient Hermes, as a password for an anonymous account. However, with the sacrificial and bestowal rituals having proven useful, the account had long been abandoned and had long since been forgotten. Since the last month and a half, no one had been noticed by Klein for copying the password, so it was possible to deduce the actual situation. As such, bank employees, who had been in contact with the password but apparently do not understand mysticism, wouldn't be able to reveal it to anyone, and Beyonders would at most make requests in the loan language, so even if they find the right person, it's not possible to connect the content described in the loan language with that of the ancient Hermes password. If anyone had copied it down, would be the first to know and would be able to respond effectively. Besides, even if someone finds the password, it would be difficult to trace it back to Sherlock Moriarty. I use a variety of means every time. Miss Justice is also sufficiently careful when saving money. While wrapping the table, Klein relaxed and said with a chuckle, "You believe that the Fool has many adorers and believers and that this would result in many clues that cannot be hidden?" Wrong, especially wrong. There's only one believer and adorer of the Fool. And that's me. When he said that, he couldn't help but let out a self-deprecating laugh. It doesn't seem like it's something that I should be proud of. I need to be a little careful for the time being. I shouldn't go around using the banner of the Fool. Klein reminded himself and went back to answering Miss Magician's prayers. He adjusted his posture, and said in a low, gentle voice, "Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it." When Furs received the answer, she was surprised but also felt that it was only right. In the eyes of Mr. Fool, the Aurora Order is nothing but a bunch of ants. Furs once again recited his honorific name in a low voice, and she curiously asked, "Honorable Mr. Fool, which existence does the Aurora Order believe in?" Then, she saw Mr. Fool sitting on a high back chair in the middle of the grey fog. He leisurely said, "The true creator. The true creator." Furza's eyes widened as she instantly understood why Mr. A suddenly sought out the believers of the Fool. With the help of the Tarot Club, that Sun youth in the City of Silver had successfully exposed the abnormality of the exploratory team and thwarted the true creator's ploy. Behind this incident is a confrontation and struggle between Mr. Fool and the true creator. Furs didn't dare to ask any further, and she quickly recounted her meeting with the members of the Abraham family. She also mentioned Lawrence's will, the strange notebook, and the Beyonder characteristic he had left behind. "Honorable Mr. Fool, what should I do?" she asked for advice with uncertainty. "What should you do? Miss Magician really is lucky. Why haven't I encountered such a good thing?" Klein responded with a chuckle, "Follow the true desires in your heart." He wasn't the least bit worried that Dorian Gray, from Pritz Harbor's Fishermen Association, would harm Miss Magician, because he knew she had 2 more stones on her bracelet, allowing her to teleport through the spirit world twice. Follow the true desires in my heart? Furs lowered her head in thought. I understand. Thank you, Mr. Fool. She decided to buy a steam locomotive ticket tomorrow. Using this mode of transportation, it would take a little over an hour to get from Backlund to Pritz Harbor, or maybe less. After reporting everything, Furs requested to hold a sacrificial and bestowal ritual. After receiving a positive response, she exchanged £600 in cash for the Sheriff Beyonder characteristic. Holding up the fist-shaped object comprised of black iron, dark red, and silver colors, as well as its beautiful spiritual radiance, Furs felt joy and admiration. Zio had long gathered the supplementary ingredients, so she would soon be promoted to Sequence 8. And I don't know when I'll become a trick master. I hope Mr. Hanged Man and the others can help me find the appropriate Beyonder ingredients as soon as possible. Zio had been subconsciously acting as an arbiter, so she didn't have to worry about her digestion of the Sequence 9 potion, but once she becomes a sheriff, what should she do? Should I ask permission from Mr. Fool to teach her the acting method, or should I simply suggest that she sneak into the police force? At the end of the long, model table, Klein looked at the thick stack of cash in front of him and carefully counted it several times. Through this method, would have £1,230. I would still be short of £300 to obtain a single Sequence 6 Beyonder ingredient. Of course, £1,500 is the minimum price, and the actual transaction price is usually much higher than this. Where else can I get money these days? As soon as the bicycle patent is granted, shall I sell a portion of the shares? Yes, I almost forgot how special the Tarot Club is. The Werewolf Beyonder characteristic cannot be sold in Backlund for now, so as to avoid being discovered by high-sequence Beyonders from the Rose School of Thought. But I can always sell it elsewhere. I'll let the world entrust Mr. Hanged Man to sell it at the Sonia C at the next gathering. I'll offer a corresponding amount of the commission as his reward. After subtracting the costs, the Werewolf Beyonder characteristic should give me at least £1,000. It will be more than enough for a single Sequence 6 Beyonder ingredient. Klein quickly came up with a plan and decided upon it. He found it a little regrettable that Miss Zio didn't seem to have much money. After she became a sheriff, even if she could quickly digest the potion, it would still take her a long time to buy the Interrogator's Beyonder characteristic. And if the Abraham family were to take interest in Miss Magician, his subsequent astrologer potion formula would no longer be marketable. What a pity. Klein sighed and returned to the real world. Wednesday morning. Klein didn't suffer from insomnia due to being targeted by the true creator and the Aurora Order's pursuit. He slept till daybreak and happily went out to buy a Desi pie for breakfast. There was no doubt that Desi pie required sweet iced tea to match it. As he enjoyed the food and flipped through the newspapers, he discovered the advertisement for the Ernst firm and learned that there would be a Beyonder gathering convened by Eye of Wisdom tomorrow night. This time, I'll be able to request to purchase the relevant Beyonder ingredients. But there's a high chance that it wouldn't be available. Even if there's something, it will be supplementary ingredients like the hair of a deep-sea naga. Klein seriously considered the channels in which he could find the ingredients. He spread out his left hand and counted with his fingers. From the Tarot Club, there are the outlets of Little Sun, Mr. Hanged Man, Miss Justice, and the rest. Beyond that, I have Eye of Wisdom's gathering, Miss Bodyguard and Merrick, but I shouldn't contact them if possible for the time being. Also, yes, I have Vampire Emlyn White. Didn't he mention that he would write to ask some powerful sanguines? That's what social connections can bring about. Coming to this thought, Klein immediately decided to go to the Harvest Church to wait for Emlyn White. Although it was impossible for the Aurora Order to track him down, it still gave him a sense of urgency, making him want to gather the Beyonder ingredients as soon as possible. Once he digested his potion, he would quickly advance to Sequence 6. 10 in the morning, south of the bridge, Rose Street. In his double-breasted frock coat, Klein took off his half-top hat and strolled into the rather small Harvest Church. At first glance, he saw the giant-like Father Yatravsky in Emlyn White, who was dressed in brown priest robes. The latter was wiping the candle lamps with a numb look on his face, as though he would rather be dead. What a coincidence. Wait, don't tell me he's here for the entire day? He only returns home at night? Klein casually found a seat and sat down. There were less than 5 devotees in the entire cathedral. Emlyn White also saw him and put down the rag. He walked over and sat beside him. The vampire's expression suddenly became lively. He raised his chin and said with a chuckle, "You came here suddenly because you have something you need my help with, right?" Chapter 407, The True Adorer Inside the Harvest Church. Klein tilted his head to glance at Emlyn White. Without ruining the serene atmosphere, he deliberately suppressed his voice and laughed, returning with a question. "Are you short on money?" As soon as the words left his mouth, he felt as if he were asking if Emlyn knew about the multi-level marketing company, Amway. Emlyn was first taken aback before he scoffed. "Don't insult a noble sanguine with money." Klein instantly sneered. Looking at the tall and brawny Father Yatravsky in front of him, he said rather casually, "According to what I know, those handmade puppets are not cheap. They can even be called expensive, especially those that are as tall as a human." Emlyn gaped his mouth in an attempt to retort, but he failed to say a word. After a moment of silence, he coughed lightly, feigned indifference, and said, "Tell me, what is it that you want my help with? I'm not a sanguine who likes riddles." Klein didn't look at the vampire next to him. He smiled and said, "I have a friend who is about to advance. He needs to collect the relevant Beyonder ingredients. I wonder if you can help? Are you doubting the capabilities of a sanguine?" Emlyn White said arrogantly. "Even if I don't have them, I can write and inquire from the nobler excellencies. That's what I want." Klein immediately responded with a deluge of words: "Mutated pituitary gland of 1,000-faced hunter and 100 milliliters of its blood. Characteristic of a human-skinned shadow and 5 strands of a deep-sea naga. As long as I can get any of these, I will pay you the corresponding price. The cheaper the price, the more you will be rewarded." He purposefully increased the number of supplementary ingredients to avoid any losses. Upon hearing this description without any stuttering, Emlyn White suddenly felt as if he had fallen into a trap of sophistry. He calmed his emotions and said, "The cost for the Beyonder ingredients is at least £100, while supplementary ingredients are at least £10. Although I'm not clear of the level of the things you want, I believe that they're definitely not cheap or common. Otherwise, you wouldn't have come to me for help." "Very smart." Klein laughed. Deal. At this moment, Emlyn White had a deep suspicion that he was asking for too little. Therefore, he added, Mr. Detective, do you have any clues on removing the psychological cues? Seeing that Father Yatravsky was concentrating on his prayers at the altar ahead of them, Klein turned to glance at the vampire and said, I have the simplest method. What? Emlyn White's red eyes lit up. Defeat Bishop Yatravsky and snatch his mental terror candle away, Klein said with a chuckle. After you meet up with your parents, you should possess the strength needed. Are 3 sanguines not the match of a single Dawn Paladin? The corners of Emlyn's mouth twitched as his expression collapsed. We lost. We couldn't beat him. My parents were nearly captured. That mental terror candle is really strange, so you've already tried. The entire family almost converted to become believers of Mother Earth. 3 sanguines weren't even able to defeat Father Yatravsky? With the help of the mental terror candle and the blood transfuser, Father Yatravsky is that terrifying? Or are vampires too weak? However, all the rumors point towards vampires being rather powerful. Klein said in thought, then you can write a letter and ask for the help of the Noble Excellencies. There shouldn't be a lack of powerful experts among the sanguine. Emlyn White answered with a numb expression, they refused. Suddenly, he looked at Klein with hope. Can you defeat Father Yatravsky? Or could your friend beat him? After receiving the sun brooch and the biological poison bottle and digesting most of the potion, I originally thought that I would be able to defeat Father Yatravsky in my spirit-body state. However, your description just now made me uncertain. Is the mental terror candle that bizarre? This kind of sealed artifact is obviously great at restraining spirit bodies. Klein rationally shook his head. No way. He quickly changed the subject. Why would those noble excellencies of the sanguine refuse your request? To them, this should be a simple favor. Emlyn White's face instantly turned ashen. They say that Father Yatravsky is an adorer of Mother Earth. They do not wish to enter into direct conflict with him. They are studying means to remove the psychological cue. For example, they are venturing deep into the Sonya Sea, the Fog Sea, and the Berserk Sea, in search of the dragons that have long secluded themselves. He added with a smile even uglier than a weeping face, by the time they figure it out or find a dragon well versed in the psyche domain, I might have already become a devout believer of Mother Earth. I'm beginning to appreciate how precious life is and how joyful a harvest is. An adorer of Mother Earth? Father Yatravsky is an adorer of Mother Earth? It's no wonder that he has so many mystical items. From the looks of it, as a powerful pirate, suddenly switching to the Mother Earth wasn't a simple matter. Klein sighed, and then he felt a sense of lingering fear. He had almost agreed to Emlyn White's request to attempt to defeat Father Yatravsky. If I lose, then I might even be locked up in the basement and forced into confinement. If I win, I might just offend another deity. No, there's no way of me winning. The adorer of Mother Earth definitely has an appropriate trump card. If it wasn't for Father Yatravsky suppressing his split personality, then I probably wouldn't have been able to defeat him. Klein wisely didn't pursue the topic. He once again looked at Father Yatravsky and said, you can try to find an organization called the Psychology Alchemists. Otherwise, you'll have to wait for Miss Justice of our Tarot Club to become a psychiatrist. By then, you might be reluctant to break away from the faith of Mother Earth. Klein silently added. To him, it was best if Emlyn White also joined the Psychology Alchemists. That way, if Miss Justice encountered any problems in the organization, he could help her with other resources, and Klein wouldn't always have to summon himself, who was the trinity of the fool, an adorer, and a believer. Psychology Alchemists? I've never heard of it. Emlyn shook his head disdainfully. It must be a secret organization that recently appeared. This organization has existed for 100 or 200 years, at the very least. Klein denied his statement. For a sanguine with a long lifespan, 1 or 200 years means it recently appeared. Among the noble excellencies, a nap might be as long as a century, Emlyn White said proudly. Without waiting for Klein to speak, he looked ahead, cleared his throat, and said, "Do you know how to contact that organization?" Klein was going to answer that there was a man in the Tingen City's asylum named Dr. Daxter Guderian, who's a member of the Psychology Alchemists, but he stopped those words just before they came out of his mouth. "With the true creator targeting me, it's best that I don't get involved with people or matters in Tingen. There's a certain risk of exposure, and once exposed, with the Aurora Order's madness, they would definitely not let Benson and Melissa go." Klein slightly shook his head and said, "I've only heard of this organization. You can write and ask the other Sanguine." Emlyn White was disappointed and stopped talking about it. He turned his head to look at Klein and said, "I'm guessing your friend who's about to advance is you." Klein looked forward without a care and replied leisurely, "Congratulations, you got it right." Emlyn White was stunned. This was completely different from what he had expected. Noticing his change, Klein laughed softly. "Mr. White, the most suitable job for you isn't to be an apothecary but to be an actor." Emlyn was stunned at first, but he immediately raised his head arrogantly and said, "I'm a deep, noble Sanguine. I don't rely on my looks to make a living. Do you think I'm praising you for being handsome?" Klein slowly stood up and laughed. "No, I mean, you are very talented at comedy." While Emlyn White's expression froze, he squeezed his way out to the aisle and said, "Don't forget what I entrusted you with. Pritz Harbor, White Oak Street." Furs Wall took the steam locomotive early in the morning and arrived at the kingdom's largest and most important port. She had also booked tickets for her return trip by boat, which was relatively inexpensive. Taking in the smell of the sea, Furs saw many of the dockworkers who were in a hurry. In the middle of each season, the port was swarming with temporary workers for relatively decent pay, and many poor people living in Backland's East Borough would head southeast on foot and in groups, traveling a distance of more than 60 kilometers. This was the same thing they did when harvesting hops. The roads are wider than Backland's, and the air quality isn't bad, but it's relatively dirtier. Furs looked around and found the Fishermen Association in an old building. Without much trouble, she met Dorian Gray in an office. The gentleman was of medium build, with exaggerated arms. His hair was combed rather neatly, completely unlike most of the members of the association who had hairstyles that looked like bird nests. He should also be an Abraham family member. After explaining the purpose of her visit, Furs passed Lawrence's will, along with the strange notebook and the diamond-like Beyonder characteristic. Dorian received the items with a complicated expression before opening the will first. After reading it carefully, he lifted his head and looked earnestly at Furs with his blue eyes. "Your kindness and honor are praiseworthy. Ms. Wall, I shall always remember the help you provided Alyssa and Lawrence. Can you accept my gratitude? I wish to invite you to lunch." "No problem." Furs was still wondering how to pass the time before her ship sailed. Dorian immediately arranged for her to wait in the next lounge, offering black tea, snacks, newspapers, and magazines. Returning to the office, the gentleman opened a hidden cabinet with some misgivings and took out an item. It was a pure crystal ball shining with a radiant light. "You're tuning in to the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories."